Life has a funny way of putting you in situations you'd never expect. I wasn't looking for anything extraordinary, just a job to pay the bills. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. When I saw the listing for an animal caretaker, I thought, why not? I've always liked animals. They don't judge, they don't argue, they just exist. At the time, things were tight. Rent was overdue. My fridge looked like a barren wasteland, and my phone buzzed with friendly reminders about bills. You've been there, right? Desperate times call for quick decisions, and this seemed simple enough. Feed the animals, keep their spaces clean, and clock out. No degree required, no previous experience necessary. Perfect. When I called the number, I expected a bored receptionist or a robotic voicemail, but instead, I got this deep, calm voice. "We've been looking for someone like you," the man said. "Not someone willing, not someone available, but someone like me." Strange, right? I brushed it off. The guy asked if I could meet him at the facility later that night. Yes, night. That should have been my first red flag. But I'm a night owl, always have been. Nights are quiet, peaceful, my kind of vibe. So I didn't think twice about it. The facility, as he called it, was tucked away at the edge of town. No signs, no big gates, nothing that screamed official. It looked more like an old warehouse with a few lights flickering outside. My first thought was, did I just sign up for some shady underground gig? But again, desperate times. I parked my car, took a deep breath, and stepped out. The air was heavy, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you know you're alone. The building smelled like damp wood and metal, a mix of old and forgotten things. Inside, it wasn't much better. Dim lights lined the hallways, casting long shadows on the walls. I half expected rats to scurry past me. Instead, there was a small reception desk, and behind it sat a man in his 50s, wearing a plain gray uniform. His name tag read, Mr. Harland. He didn't look up right away. When he finally did, his piercing eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt like I'd walked into something bigger than myself. But he smiled, an odd, almost forced smile, and motioned for me to sit. "So, you're here for the caretaker position?" His voice was calm but had this weight to it, like he was testing me with every word. I nodded, trying to act cool, but my hands were clenched so tightly in my lap I thought they might leave marks. He explained the job. Feed the animals twice a night, clean up their spaces if needed, and make sure all enclosures were secure. Simple enough. "And the animals?" I asked. "What kind are we talking about?" He paused. It wasn't a long pause, but it felt heavy, like he was deciding whether or not to answer. "Exotic," he said finally. "Rare. You won't find these in any zoo." That should have been my second red flag, but curiosity got the better of me. Plus, I wasn't exactly in a position to be picky. "Sounds interesting," I said, trying to sound casual. Mr. Harland leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "One thing you should know, we have rules here. Follow them no matter what. If you can't, this job isn't for you." "Rules?" Sure, every job has rules, right? But the way he said it didn't feel like he was talking about safety regulations or company policies. It felt personal. "Got it," I said, though I wasn't sure I did. "Good," he said, sliding a small notebook across the desk. "Your shift starts tomorrow night. Read this before then. Memorize it." I flipped through the notebook later that night in my car, and that's when I started to feel uneasy. The rules weren't normal. Don't look directly into their eyes. If one of them speaks, don't respond. And the last one, never, ever open the red door. My stomach twisted. This was no ordinary job. But by then, it was too late. I was in. The next night, I drove back to the facility. It was quiet just like before, but now I felt different, less confident. That little notebook sat in the passenger seat, and I'd read through it more times than I wanted to admit. The rules. They weren't just instructions, they felt like warnings. Here's a taste of what I'm talking about. If the lights in the main hallway flicker, stop walking and wait for them to stabilize. Do not look behind you. Ignore any knocking on the door during feeding rounds. No matter how loud or desperate it sounds, if you hear a growl, hum softly. Keep humming until it stops. Never, under any circumstance, open the red door. At first I thought, okay, this has to be a joke. It read more like something out of a horror movie than a job manual. But then I remembered Mr. Harlan's face. Calm, serious, like he wasn't messing around. Still, I tried to convince myself it was just some over-the-top safety policy. You know, the kind of thing they add to scare off people who aren't serious about the job. But deep down, something didn't sit right. When I arrived, the place looked just as eerie as the night before. The lights outside still flickered, and the shadows they cast seemed to stretch longer than they should. As I walked inside, I noticed the air felt heavier, like the walls were closing in on me. Mr. Harlan was already waiting at the front desk. This time, he wasn't smiling. "You read the rules?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yeah," I said, holding up the notebook. "And they're different," I admitted. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Different isn't the word I'd use. They're important. Memorize them. Stick to them. You'll be fine." I nodded, but my throat felt tight. I wanted to ask why these rules existed, what they were really about, but something in his expression told me not to push. Instead, I asked, "What happens if you don't follow them?" His face didn't change. He just said, "You don't want to find out." Mr. Harlan led me through the main hallway, where the enclosures were. The smell of damp metal and something earthy filled the air. It wasn't unpleasant, but it felt wrong, somehow, like the kind of scent that lingered in places it shouldn't. We passed the first enclosure, and I couldn't see much through the foggy glass. Just a faint silhouette, something big with long limbs and a hunched back. My instinct was to slow down and get a better look, but Mr. Harlan's hand shot out, motioning me to keep walking. "Don't linger," he said, not even glancing at the enclosure. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer. That's when I noticed the red door at the end of the hallway. It looked ordinary enough, wooden with chipped paint and a rusted handle. But something about it made my skin crawl. "That's the red door," he said, his voice lower now. "You know the rule." I nodded quickly, not trusting myself to say anything. The rest of the tour was just as unsettling. Mr. Harlan explained the feeding process. Each enclosure had a small metal slot where you'd slide the food tray through. Never open the main door. Never stick your hand in. And if you ever hear anything unusual, growling, scratching, or even voices, step away and wait. "What kind of animals are these?" I asked again, hoping this time he'd give me a straight answer. "Exotic," he repeated, his tone making it clear that was all I was getting. He handed me a keyring, each one marked with a number that matched an enclosure. Then, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Stick to the rules, and you'll get through your shift just fine." I tried to act casual as I nodded, but my mind was racing. Why all the secrecy? Why all the rules? And why did I feel like I was being watched every time I stepped near one of the enclosures? When Mr. Harlan left, I stood alone in the main hallway, clutching the keys like they were a lifeline. The place was quiet, too quiet. No animals making noise, no hum of machinery, just the faint buzz of the overhead lights. I decided to start with the first enclosure, the one with the foggy glass. The slot for the food tray was cold and slightly damp when I touched it. I slid the tray through, half expecting to hear something, maybe a grunt or the sound of claws on metal, but there was nothing. I took a step back, waiting, but nothing moved. As I turned to head to the next enclosure, I heard it. A soft knock, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze. It wasn't loud, just faint, like someone gently tapping on a door. The rules flashed in my mind. Ignore any knocking. I told myself it was probably just the pipes or the building settling. Old places make noises, right? But the knocking came again, 3 short, deliberate taps. I clenched my fists and kept walking, my steps quicker now. By the time I reached the second enclosure, my heart was pounding. I slid the tray through and stepped back, half expecting another sound. Instead, I felt a cold draft brush past me, even though the air was still. As I finished the first round of feeding, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The notebook rules swirled in my mind, each one a thread pulling tighter around my nerves. I hadn't broken any rules, but the night was far from over. For the first hour, nothing happened. It was almost boring. The animals stayed quiet, the halls were still, and I started to think I'd overhyped everything in my head. Maybe the rules were just a precaution, a way to keep the workers alert. I mean, think about it. Don't look behind you? Don't open a door? It all felt a little ridiculous in the bright glow of the hallway lights. So I let myself relax just a bit. Big mistake. I was midway through my second round of feeding when it started. I had just finished with enclosure 3, sliding the tray through the slot, when the lights in the hallway flickered. Not a subtle flicker, but a sudden, almost angry burst, as if the bulbs were struggling to stay alive. My heart skipped. The rules flashed in my mind. If the lights flicker, stop walking and wait. Do not look behind you. I froze where I stood, gripping the keyring so hard it bit into my palm. The hallway went dark for what felt like forever. I could hear the faint hum of the electricity trying to kick back on, but all I could think about was that second part of the rule. Don't look behind you. I told myself it was nothing, just faulty wiring, maybe a storm outside that I hadn't noticed. But then I felt it. The air behind me changed, colder, heavier, pressed against my back like a weight, and for a second, I thought I heard breathing. Slow, steady, too close. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to look, to confirm there was nothing there. But I couldn't. Instead, I focused on the sound of my own breathing, trying to keep it quiet, steady. The lights flickered one more time, then stayed on. The cold air vanished as quickly as it had come. I stood there for a moment, letting my heart settle, and then forced myself to move. At the next enclosure, my hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped the food tray. I slid it through the slot and stepped back quickly, keeping my eyes fixed on the glass. For the first time, I saw movement. It was subtle, just a shadow shifting near the back of the enclosure, but it was enough to send a chill crawling up my spine. Whatever was inside wasn't small. It wasn't harmless. I tried to shake it off and continue the rounds, but I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see, I don't even know, someone. By the time I reached the staff room for my break, I was on edge. The room was small and bare, a table, a chair, and a monitor displaying the security camera feeds. I poured myself a cup of stale coffee, hoping it would calm my nerves, and glanced at the monitor. Most of the enclosures were still, the animals either hidden or asleep. But one feed caught my attention. Enclosure 7. The camera showed an empty space, just the plain metal walls of the enclosure. But I knew I'd fed something there. I'd heard it moving. I leaned closer, staring at the screen, and that's when it happened. A shadow. It darted across the frame, too fast for me to make out any details, but big enough to make my stomach drop. I tapped the monitor, hoping it was just a glitch, but the shadow appeared again, closer this time. Then the screen went black. I stumbled back from the monitor, my pulse racing. The rules didn't say anything about what to do if a camera feed went out. Should I check the enclosure? Call Mr. Harland? No. The rules were clear about one thing. Follow them and you'll be fine. I had to trust that. Still, the next round felt different. The halls seemed darker, quieter, like the air itself was waiting for something. As I approached enclosure 7, I noticed the food tray I'd slid in earlier was untouched. The metal slot was slightly ajar, though, like something or someone had tried to open it. I stared at it, my gut screaming at me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. The rules said nothing about skipping enclosures. Carefully, I slid the tray back through and stepped away, my eyes glued to the foggy glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, deep enough to rattle the walls. The rules flashed again in my mind. If you hear a growl, hum softly. Hum? That's what they wanted me to do. I hesitated, my mind racing, but the growl came again, louder this time. My throat was dry, but I started to hum. A shaky, uneven melody, the first thing that came to mind. The growling stopped just like that. I stood there, humming, until my voice cracked. Then I backed away slowly, my legs shaking, and made my way to the next enclosure. By the end of the night, I was exhausted mentally, physically, in every possible way. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were survival tactics, each one more unsettling than the last. I sat in my car after my shift, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the building. The job paid well, sure, but was it worth this? As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, that the rules weren't just about keeping the animals contained. They were about keeping me alive. I told myself I'd quit after one more night. No paycheck was worth the constant fear, the rules that felt more like riddles, and the sense that this place was alive in ways I couldn't explain. But when I walked through the doors for what I thought would be my final shift, everything felt different. The air was colder, heavier, like the building itself was warning me to turn back. Still, I pushed forward. The sooner I started, the sooner I'd be out of there. The first few rounds were uneventful, almost eerily so. The animals were quiet, the hallways still. I told myself it was a blessing, but deep down I knew better. The calm never lasted. It was during my second round that I noticed something was wrong. The hallway lights flickered again. Longer this time, as if they were struggling against something unseen. I stopped walking, just like the rules said, my breath caught in my throat. The shadows on the walls stretched unnaturally, bending and twisting in ways they shouldn't. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing faintly behind me. My heart raced, my body stiff. I knew the rule, don't look behind you. But knowing and doing are two very different things. The footsteps got louder, closer, until they stopped just a few feet away. I could feel something standing there, watching me. I clenched my fists, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I stayed rooted to the spot. And then it spoke, a low, distorted voice, like it was crawling its way through a broken speaker. Why are you here? My mind went blank. The rules didn't say anything about this. Leave, the voice hissed, cold and sharp, sending a shiver down my spine. Before it's too late. The lights flickered one last time before stabilizing, and just like that, the presence was gone. I rushed through the rest of the round, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the keyring. By the time I reached the staff room, I felt like I'd been running a marathon. I sat down, my back to the wall, and tried to catch my breath. The security monitor was on, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. I didn't want to see whatever was lurking out there. But then I heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from the hallway outside the staff room. It wasn't knocking, exactly, more like something sharp dragging against the walls. Tap, tap, scratch. The sound got louder, closer, until it stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, praying it would go away, but then the doorknob rattled. The rules flashed in my mind. Ignore any knocking. But this wasn't knocking. This was worse. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. But then a voice, soft and childlike, came from the other side of the door. Please, help me. My blood ran cold. Let me in, the voice pleaded, trembling like it was barely holding back tears. I wanted to scream, to run, but all I could do was sit there, frozen. My mind raced. It's not real. It's not real. The voice grew louder, more desperate. Please, they're going to hurt me. Tears welled in my eyes. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time, like something was throwing its full weight against the door. And then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, I forced myself to move. My legs felt like jelly as I stood and opened the door, half expecting to see. I don't even know. But the hallway was empty, as if nothing had happened. I convinced myself to finish the shift. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I didn't, whatever was in this place would come after me. By the time I reached the final enclosure, I was running on pure adrenaline. The red door loomed at the end of the hallway, its chipped paint almost glowing under the flickering lights. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The rule was simple. Never, ever open the red door. But something was different. The air around the door seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from asphalt. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from behind the door. Come closer. I backed away, my hands trembling. Please, the voice said, soft and sweet. It's safe. Promise. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus on the rule. Never open the door. But then I heard something else. Footsteps. Behind me. They were slow, heavy, and getting closer. I turned to see a shadow stretching down the hallway, long and impossibly thin. My mind raced. If I stayed, whatever was behind me would catch me. But if I opened the door, I didn't have time to think. The footsteps were almost on top of me now, and in a moment of pure panic, I grabbed the handle of the red door and pulled it open. What I saw on the other side, I still can't explain it. The hallway disappeared, replaced by a swirling, endless void. Shadows moved within it, shapes I couldn't understand, their voices echoing in my head. Why did you open it? One of them hissed. I stumbled back, but it was too late. The door slammed shut on its own, and the lights in the hallway went out completely. For the first time since I started this job, I broke the rules, and I knew I wouldn't make it out unscathed. I don't remember how I got out of that hallway. One moment, I was standing in front of the red door, staring into that endless void, and the next, I was outside, gasping for air under the flickering light of the building's entrance. My hands were trembling, my knees weak, but somehow, I was alive. The door had shut itself behind me, sealing away whatever was on the other side. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The rules, the whispers, the shadows. I couldn't tell if it had been real or some kind of twisted nightmare. But then I looked down at my hand. There was a mark there, faint but unmistakable. A jagged black line, almost like a burn, running across my palm where I'd touched the handle of the red door. It stung when I pressed it, as if it were alive. I didn't stay to ask questions. I drove home, my heart pounding the entire way, half expecting something to follow me. Every shadow on the road seemed to stretch toward me, every sound magnified in the silence of the night. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was drenched in sweat. My grip on the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The next day, I quit. I didn't go back to the facility, didn't call to explain. I just left the keys and the notebook in a box outside the front gate and walked away. But leaving the job didn't mean leaving the experience behind. Every night since, I've heard the whispers, faint at first, like a breeze slipping through a crack in the window, but they've grown louder, closer. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that void again. The shadows, the shapes, the endless nothingness staring back at me. And then there's the mark. It hasn't faded. If anything, it's gotten darker, the edges spreading like veins under my skin. I don't know what it means, but I can feel it pulsing. I've tried to tell myself it's all in my head, that I'm just imagining things. But deep down, I know the truth. That door wasn't meant to be opened. And whatever I let out, it hasn't finished with me yet. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I wonder, what would have happened if I had just followed the rules? But it's too late for that now. All I can do is wait. For what? I don't know. But it's coming. Subscribe for more horror stories every day. The neighborhood looked picture perfect. Rows of identical houses sat neatly side by side, their freshly painted exteriors gleaming under the afternoon sun. The kind of place you'd see in a brochure, promising peace, safety, and the perfect suburban life. Think you know how this story ends? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. I stepped out of the moving truck, taking in the familiar scent of freshly mowed grass and clean, crisp air. Felt like the ideal place to settle down, to begin again. New town, new start. As I made my way to the front door of my new house, I noticed how quiet it was. Not a dog barking, not a child playing. Just silence. Even the wind seemed to have taken the day off. I chalked it up to it being a weekday, but something about the stillness lingered in my mind, gnawing at the back of it like a quiet, unspoken thought. The door opened with a soft creak, and I stepped inside, feeling the cool rush of air conditioning hit my skin. The house smelled of new wood, fresh paint, and something else. There was a faint sweetness to the air, like flowers, except the flowers weren't blooming. It was odd, but I didn't think too much about it. Just the newness of it all, I figured. I set my bags down in the hallway, the floors creaking slightly underfoot. The place looked immaculate, too immaculate, almost. The walls were white, the floors were gleaming, and everything was perfectly in place, as if no one had ever lived here before. But that wasn't true, was it? I hadn't been the first to step through these doors. I shrugged off the thought and headed into the kitchen. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the otherwise silent house. I opened the refrigerator, but it was nearly empty. Just a few bottles of water and some takeout containers from the previous owner. I was about to close the door when I heard something. A faint creak from somewhere upstairs. I paused, listening. Nothing. Probably just the house settling. I told myself that. It was an old house, after all, built sometime in the late 70s. I turned back to the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of water, and headed for the living room. The silence returned. It was thick, almost like the air itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake the feeling of unease that was creeping up my spine, but it didn't go away. The feeling of being watched. I set the water bottle down on the coffee table and looked around the room. Everything was so neat, so clean. I couldn't help but notice the windows. The curtains were all drawn, the rooms hidden in shadow. In a house that was supposed to be full of sunlight, it felt a little too dark. A knock at the door broke the silence. I hesitated for a moment before going to answer it. When I opened the door, a middle-aged man stood there, smiling wide. His handshake was firm, his eyes steady, but something about him felt forced, like he was trying too hard to be friendly. "Hi, I'm Steve. I live across the street. Welcome to the neighborhood," he said. His voice warm but with an undertone that made me uncomfortable. I nodded, offering a smile in return. "Thanks. It's good to be here." He studied me for a moment, his eyes lingering too long, as if he was looking for something, trying to figure me out. Then he quickly shifted his gaze, glancing over his shoulder as if checking that no one else was around. "We're having a little barbecue on Saturday if you'd like to come. Meet the neighbors." He didn't wait for me to answer. "I'll let you get settled. Don't want to keep you." His smile lingered, but it didn't reach his eyes. I nodded again, closing the door softly behind him. The moment I turned away, I felt a weird shift in the air, like something had just happened, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I shook it off, reminding myself that it was just a neighborhood get-together. But Steve's smile, and the way he looked at me, stuck with me. I walked to the window, peering out from behind the curtains. Across the street, Steve stood in his yard, talking to someone I couldn't see. And then, just as I was about to pull back, I caught a glimpse, a shadow moving behind one of his curtains. It was quick, just a flash, but it left me feeling like I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I tried to dismiss it as my mind playing tricks, but the feeling of unease remained. Something wasn't right here. The next morning I woke up early. The sun had barely started to rise, casting long shadows across the empty streets of my new neighborhood. It was eerily quiet, even more so than before. As I unpacked boxes and settled in, I thought back to my conversation with Steve the day before. The barbecue invitation lingered in my mind, but there was something about the way he'd spoken that made me uncomfortable. I brushed it off, though. Maybe I was just overthinking things. By mid-morning, I decided to head over to the local convenience store just to get a feel for the area. As I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the lack of activity. No kids riding bikes, no elderly neighbors sitting on their porches. Just the sound of my footsteps echoing down the street. I arrived at the store, greeted by the familiar jingle of the doorbell. The inside was small, but it had everything I needed. The shelves were neatly stocked, and the aisles were practically empty. Felt like I was the only customer. A strange sensation crept up my spine, but I shook it off. As I approached the counter to pay, the woman behind the register smiled, though her eyes seemed distant. She scanned my items slowly, her movements deliberate, almost methodical. Then she spoke. "You new to the neighborhood?" she asked, her voice soft but cold. "Yeah, just moved in yesterday," I replied, trying to sound casual. She nodded. "Nice. You'll find it's a quiet place. People here value privacy, you know. Very private." I gave her a nod, unsure of how to respond. "By the way," she continued, leaning closer, "there are a few rules around here. Things you should know. They're important, really. Don't break them." My curiosity piqued. I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of rules?" She paused, her gaze flicking around the room before settling back on me. "Well, first off, always check the security cameras at the front of your house before you leave. Every time. It's for your safety. The neighborhood is safe, but it's best to be cautious." I nodded slowly. "All right, makes sense. And don't ever leave your windows open at night," she added. "Keep them locked. You don't know who might be watching. Some people, well, they can't be trusted." I couldn't help but feel a knot tightening in my stomach. This was all a little strange, but I didn't want to seem rude. "Okay, I'll keep that in mind." She handed me my change and smiled again, but this time, it felt more forced. "And one more thing, don't ask too many questions about the neighbors. It's better if you just leave things be. Everyone here has their own way of doing things." Stick to your own business. That's how it works around here. Her words left me feeling unsettled, but I tried to push the discomfort aside. I took my bags and left the store, the weight of her warning still hanging in the air. The whole exchange had felt too rehearsed, too practiced, as if she'd said those exact words to every new person who moved into the neighborhood. On my walk back, I noticed the same stillness. The streets were empty, and the houses all looked the same. No movement, no noise. When I reached my house, I did what the woman had suggested. I checked the security cameras outside my house. Everything seemed fine, but then I felt a strange pressure in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just paranoia. It was probably the newness of the place, the unfamiliarity. But as I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, something about the whole situation didn't sit right. Later that evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to meet some of the neighbors. I kept my eyes peeled for anyone walking around, but the streets remained eerily quiet. I passed a few houses, all of which had their windows closed, blinds drawn. There were no porch lights on, no movement behind any of the windows. It felt like a ghost town, despite the houses being full of life just the day before. As I walked, I spotted a man standing in his driveway, staring at the ground. He was dressed in a loose, faded shirt and jeans, his hands in his pockets. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, even though the sun had already set. There was something off about him, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I gave him a polite wave as I walked past, but he didn't respond. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how odd it was. Every time I had seen someone in this neighborhood, they were either inside their homes or out in the yard, always in a way that felt controlled, like they were following an unspoken routine. There were no spontaneous chats, no neighborly greetings, just stiff, mechanical interactions. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window into the dark. I couldn't help but think about what the woman at the store had said. Stick to your own business, she'd warned. Don't ask too many questions. Felt like a warning, not just advice. I grabbed a notebook and began jotting down my thoughts, trying to make sense of it all. The rules were simple, practical even. But why did everyone take them so seriously? They were more than just suggestions. There was an underlying weight to them. Like they weren't just rules, they were expectations, and breaking them might have consequences. As I scribbled, I heard the faintest noise, like a door creaking open, followed by hushed whispers. The house next door. I froze. The whispers grew louder, but I couldn't make out the words. I stood up and went to the window, peeking out from behind the blinds. Nothing. I shook my head. Just the wind. Or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But the unease continued to grow, deepening as the night stretched on. The days that followed felt like they were slipping away, each one blurring into the next. I tried to keep a low profile, focusing on settling in and finding my rhythm in the neighborhood. Despite the unsettling warnings from the woman at the convenience store and the strange rules I'd heard about, I tried to convince myself it was all just part of the normality of a small, tight-knit community. But each time I turned my key in the lock, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things. A door that I was certain had been locked was now ajar. I'd find my curtains drawn back when I was sure I'd left them closed. It was like the house had a life of its own. At first, I convinced myself that I was just imagining things. I was tired from moving and trying to settle in. Maybe it was just the unfamiliarity of everything that had my nerves on edge. But when it started happening more frequently, I couldn't ignore it anymore. One morning, I came downstairs to find my front door wide open. I froze in the doorway, my heart racing. I was sure I'd locked it the night before, but there it was, open, not just ajar, but wide enough that I could see the empty street outside. The neighborhood, as usual, was silent. No one in sight. I quickly checked the lock on the door. It hadn't been tampered with, and everything seemed in order. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. As I walked to the kitchen to grab some coffee, I noticed the flickering of the light overhead. It wasn't constant, but it flashed on and off in a slow rhythm, like the light bulb was struggling to stay lit. I tried to ignore it, reaching for the switch to turn it off. But before I could, it flickered again, brighter this time. A sound followed, soft and distant. A tapping, almost like a whisper in the air. My eyes darted to the door, to the windows. No one was there. I gripped the counter, trying to steady my racing pulse. I told myself it was the old wiring in the house, or maybe the neighbor's house had a problem with their power lines. It was a stretch, but it was all I had to hold on to. A few days later, things took an even stranger turn. I was at the local diner, grabbing lunch when I overheard a conversation between two of the regulars sitting at the counter. They were talking about the neighborhood in a way that made me uneasy. "It's not like it used to be," one of them said in a hushed voice, almost too quiet to hear. "People don't stay long anymore. You ever notice that?" His companion nodded. I noticed. Every time someone new moves in, they never last. Something about this place. Something's not right. I tried not to listen, but their words lingered in my mind as I finished my meal. I didn't ask them about it. I couldn't, not after everything that had already happened. Later that evening, as I was reviewing some files I'd brought home from work, I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. I wasn't a night owl, but something kept me up. That feeling of being watched, of being drawn to check on things I didn't understand. I heard the same soft tapping sound again, distant but growing louder. This time it was coming from upstairs, just above me. I stood up slowly, holding my breath. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. The tapping was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I reached for the doorknob to my bedroom and paused. Something didn't feel right. With a deep breath, I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps barely making a sound as I crept upstairs. Every shadow in the house seemed to shift around me, stretching and pulling in ways that didn't make sense. I finally reached the top of the stairs and stood in front of the door to the room where I kept my things. The sound had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. I pushed the door open slowly. Nothing. The room was as it had always been, neat and untouched. Yet the sense of wrongness lingered. I couldn't explain it. It was like the walls themselves were pressing in on me, closing me in, but I couldn't leave. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the stillness pressing on me from all sides. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of doubts and questions, none of which I could answer. Was I imagining things? Or was there really something wrong with this place? The next morning, I went to the hospital to work, hoping to escape the oddities of my home, even if only for a few hours. But when I checked the patient roster, something caught my eye. One name stood out, Jacob Carter. I'd never seen that name before, but there it was, listed as a patient in room 312. I double-checked the list. Jacob Carter. Same name, same room number. I asked a nurse passing by if she knew who he was. She glanced at the list, then at me, confusion flickering in her eyes. "That name's not on the list," she said, voice low. "We don't have a Jacob Carter here." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I looked at the list again. There it was, clear as day. Yet the nurse insisted it didn't exist. I tried to brush it off, but it gnawed at me. Later that night, I checked again. Jacob Carter's name was gone. Things continued to escalate. The strange occurrences at my house became more frequent. Doors I was sure I had locked were now open. The whispers grew louder at night, seeming to come from all directions. And the tapping, it never stopped. It was almost as if the house itself was trying to communicate with me, trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. I began to wonder if it was just me, if I was losing my mind. But then, one night, I saw something that made all of my doubts vanish. Through the window of the house next door, I saw Steve standing in his driveway again, just like before. Only this time he wasn't alone. There were others, figures standing in the shadows, their faces obscured, watching the house. It wasn't the usual quiet gaze. It was something more deliberate. I quickly stepped away from the window, my breath shallow and quick. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong with this neighborhood, and I was beginning to fear that I had stumbled into something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The whispers had become louder, the tapping more persistent, until it was almost deafening. Each night, I lay in bed, clutching the covers tightly, trying to ignore the chill that crept into the corners of the room. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching me. I had to know the truth. I had to figure out what was happening before it consumed me. But the more I searched for answers, the more I realized that every question only led to more confusion. The neighbors were odd, but I had seen them around, and their behaviors, though strange, weren't out of the ordinary for a small town. But there was one person in particular who haunted my thoughts. Steve, the man next door. Something about him didn't sit right with me. Every time I saw him, it was as though he knew something I didn't. And now, with the neighbors standing in the shadows, watching in complete silence, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to confront him. I decided to go next door, to knock on his door and demand an explanation for what was going on. Maybe it was irrational, maybe it was reckless, but it was the only thing I could think of to stop this unease that had been growing inside me. I grabbed my coat and headed out into the cold night. The sky was overcast, and the wind carried the faint scent of damp earth. As I walked toward Steve's house, my heart began to race. The street lights above flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move with me. My footsteps echoed in the silence. When I reached Steve's porch, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorbell, but something held me back. The air felt too thick, too still. I almost turned around, but then the door opened, just slightly. A crack. Steve stood in the doorway, his face expressionless. His eyes were fixed on mine, cold and distant. It was as if he was waiting for me to say something, anything, but he didn't speak. He just stared. I tried to muster up the words, but they wouldn't come. I was frozen, caught in his gaze, feeling as if every part of me was being examined. Then, out of nowhere, the lights flickered. The hum of the streetlights above faltered and died, and for a brief moment, everything was plunged into darkness. I could feel the air thickening, pressing in on me from all sides. "Steve," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What's going on? What is this place?" He didn't respond. Instead, I heard a noise from inside the house. Something shuffling, faint footsteps on the floorboards. The sound seemed to be coming closer, but when I looked into the darkened hallway, I saw nothing. The door was still slightly ajar, but it wasn't enough to see anything beyond the threshold. "Steve," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Still no response, but I felt it, a presence, something behind me, just out of sight. It was as though the shadows were closing in on me. My mind was racing, every instinct telling me to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, as if some invisible force had wrapped itself around me. Suddenly, the door slammed shut in front of me. I jumped back, heart pounding. The house went completely silent again. My pulse raced, and I stared at the door, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My breath was coming in short bursts, my hands trembling. I knew then that this wasn't just about a strange neighborhood. This was something bigger, something darker. I turned and hurried back to my house, my mind a whirlwind of panic and confusion. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I couldn't let it go on any longer. I had to get out. I had to leave this place before whatever was happening here swallowed me whole. When I reached my house, I immediately went to check the locks. I'd had enough of this place, of the whispers and the shadows. The house was supposed to be my safe haven, but it had become my prison. But when I reached the door, I froze. The lock was broken, the door wide open. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back, staring at the empty space in front of me. How? I was sure I had locked it. There was no way the door could have opened on its own. But there it was, open. The air inside the house felt heavier now. The oppressive silence pressed in on me from all sides. The shadows were longer, darker. I stepped inside cautiously, heart in my throat. That's when I heard it, the tapping. But this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. I rushed upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping was getting louder, faster, like someone was chasing me. But when I reached the top of the stairs, there was nothing there. No one, except for one thing. The door to my bedroom was ajar. And inside, standing perfectly still in the middle of the room, was the figure of a person. They were dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by the shadows. Their posture was rigid, as if they had been waiting for me. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were watching me. I could feel their gaze burning into me, even without the ability to see their eyes. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to leave, to run, but I was paralyzed. Couldn't look away. Couldn't move. Then, as if on cue, the figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. My mind screamed for me to react, to fight, to run, but my body refused. I watched in horror as they approached. "Who are you?" I whispered, barely able to breathe. The figure didn't respond, but it was clear now that they weren't going to stop. They were coming closer, and nothing I did could change that. I backed up slowly, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the lights flickered and went out. The house plunged into darkness. I could feel the presence of the figure, but I couldn't see them. The world was suddenly spinning. I didn't know where I was going. I had no control, but I had to act. I had to do something. I made a decision, a choice I knew might change everything. I don't remember much after the lights went out. I think I must have blacked out. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of my living room, drenched in cold sweat. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. My body ached, my head throbbed, and for a moment, I just laid there, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't know how much time had passed. Could have been hours or mere minutes. But when I stood up, everything felt different. The house was still, too still. The oppressive silence that had enveloped me felt like it had been waiting for something, waiting for me to acknowledge it. The figure in my room was gone. The door was still ajar, but there was no sign of anyone, no trace of the person who had been standing there. I didn't know if I was relieved or terrified. I tried to tell myself it was over, that whatever had happened, it was just a figment of my imagination, some twisted trick my mind had played on me under pressure. But deep down, I knew better. There was something I had seen, something I had felt, something real. I spent the next few days trying to push it all out of my mind. I kept myself busy, cleaning, organizing, trying to return to some semblance of normalcy. But it didn't work. The unease never left. It lingered in the corners of my thoughts, creeping in when I least expected it. Every time I passed the empty house next door, my heart would race. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the window. But there was nothing, no movement, just the same empty house. I couldn't shake the feeling that the neighbors were still there, behind the closed doors, in the shadows. And then there was Steve. I didn't see him again after that night. I didn't know if he had been real, or if I had imagined him. But I couldn't help but wonder if he had known all along what was going to happen. If he had been waiting for me to uncover something that wasn't meant to be found. I began to notice other things. Little things, like how the streetlights flickered at odd times, or how the walls of my house seemed to creak and groan when there was no wind. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing with me, sharing my anxiety. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't alone, that there was someone, still here watching, waiting. Every time I heard a knock at the door, my heart would stop. I'd freeze, my breath caught in my throat, waiting to see if someone was there. But every time it was nothing, just the silence. Yet, deep inside I knew it wasn't over. The mystery, the danger, it hadn't disappeared. It was still there, lingering, just out of reach, like a shadow in the corner of my vision. The worst part is the dreams. They come every night now. At first, I thought they were just nightmares, the aftermath of stress and fear. But the more I had them, the more I realized that they were more than that. They felt real. I could see the faces of the people who had been in the house next door, their eyes empty, vacant. They would stand there in the dark, watching me, and no matter how much I tried to wake up, I couldn't. The faces would follow me, their hollow gazes burning into me. I tried calling the police, but when they arrived, the house was empty. Not a single sign that anyone had ever lived there. No records, no neighbors. Just an abandoned, run-down property with overgrown weeds in the yard. They didn't believe me. They told me I had been under stress, that maybe I had been imagining things. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. And no matter how much I tried to explain it, I couldn't make them understand. Now I'm left with nothing but questions. What happened to the neighbors? Where did they go? What was that figure in my bedroom? Was it real? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? And what was Steve's role in all of this? I don't have answers. Maybe I never will. But I'm no longer the person I was before I moved here. That much I know for sure. The paranoia, the fear, it's always with me now. Every knock on the door, every flicker of the lights, every creak in the floorboards. It all feels like a warning, a reminder that something is out there, something I can't see, but I know is watching me. I don't know if I'll ever truly be free of this place. The darkness has followed me, and no matter how far I run, I can still feel its presence, waiting, watching, and I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time before it comes for me again. Ready for more chills and mysteries? Subscribe and turn on the bell. You never know what story is coming next. I started working at the Crestwood Theater a month ago. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job and I needed the paycheck. The place had charm, I'll give it that. An old-fashioned marquee out front with letters that someone changed by hand, the scent of buttered popcorn wafting through the air, and carpets that looked like they hadn't been replaced since the 90s. On my first day, I showed up 10 minutes early, trying to make a good impression. The manager, Mr. Carson, met me at the door. He was a wiry man in his 50s with a thin mustache and a tie that always seemed a little too tight. Punctual. I like that, he said, giving me a quick, almost mechanical smile. Let's get you settled in. The lobby was dimly lit, with a faint buzzing sound coming from somewhere overhead. Mr. Carson handed me a uniform shirt that smelled like mothballs and told me I'd start on concessions. It seemed simple enough, scooping popcorn, refilling the soda machine, and making sure the candy shelves were stocked. Do exactly what's asked of you, and you'll be fine, he said before leaving me with a curt nod. Something about the way he said it felt odd, but I brushed it off. The first hour of my shift passed uneventfully. I handed out snacks, smiled at customers, and tried to ignore the sticky floors beneath my shoes. The other employees were polite but distant. There was Kevin, a college kid with earbuds permanently hanging around his neck, and Lisa, who looked like she'd been working there for decades. Neither said much beyond the basics. Lisa's the one who first mentioned the films. Don't worry about the schedule, she said as she rearranged some bags of candy. The films change every night. You'll get used to it. Isn't that normal? I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the popcorn machine, her hands still for just a moment too long. Not like this, she said finally, her voice low enough that I almost didn't catch it. Then she walked away. The rest of the day went smoothly, or so I thought. It wasn't until I started cleaning up after the last showing that I noticed something off. The theater was empty, or at least it should have been. I was sweeping between the rows when I heard it. A faint whisper, like someone speaking just below the edge of hearing. I froze, gripping the broom handle tighter, my eyes darting toward the back of the room. "Hello," I called out. My voice echoed slightly, but there was no response. I waited a few seconds, convincing myself I'd imagined it. Then I heard it again. This time it was clearer. A word, maybe two, but I couldn't make them out. I walked to the back of the theater, my footsteps muffled by the old carpet. Nothing, just the empty seats and the faint hum of the projector cooling down. As I turned to leave, my eyes caught something on the screen. The credits were still rolling, but the names weren't familiar. They didn't look right. There were symbols mixed in, ones I couldn't read, like someone had typed gibberish into the machine. When I got back to the lobby, Lisa was locking up the ticket booth. "Do you ever hear voices in there?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She paused, her keys halfway to the lock. "Don't think about it too much," she said without looking at me. Then she pushed the door open and stepped outside, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. By the time I left that night, the buzzing sound in the lobby had stopped, but it still echoed in my head, like a faint memory I couldn't quite place. The next day, I came in for my second shift at the Crestwood Theater. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the building's vintage facade, making it look more worn than charming. Inside, the dim light and faint smell of cleaning chemicals were exactly as I'd left them. Mr. Carson was waiting for me near the concessions counter. "Good to see you back," he said, though it didn't feel like he meant it. He handed me a clipboard with a checklist. "There are a few things to keep in mind if you want to stick around here." He tapped the top of the clipboard with his pen for emphasis. The list seemed straightforward at first glance. Make sure the theater screens are clean before each showing. Always lock the storage room after retrieving supplies. Never leave the projection room unattended during a film. Double-check the auditorium after the last showing to ensure no one's left behind. Under no circumstances, stay inside the theater after 2 a.m. I remember chuckling under my breath at the last rule. "What happens at 2:01? I joked, trying to lighten the mood. Mr. Carson didn't laugh. Instead, he gave me a look that made my skin crawl, like I just asked something I shouldn't have. "You won't need to worry about that if you do your job," he said, his tone flat but somehow unnerving. Then he walked off without another word. The shift was busier than the first. Families came for the early matinee, their kids clutching oversized buckets of popcorn. Couples drifted in for the evening shows, holding hands as they picked seats in the back rows. It was normal, almost comforting in its predictability. I kept telling myself that whatever I thought I'd heard or seen the night before was just nerves. First day jitters, nothing more. But then I overheard Kevin in the break room. "She stayed past 2 once," he said, popping a piece of gum into his mouth. "Who?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He blinked at me, like he'd forgotten I was even there. "Lisa, what happened?" He shrugged, but there was something in his expression, like he wanted to say more but didn't know how. "She's still here, isn't she?" I pressed. Kevin hesitated before answering. "Yeah, but she hasn't been the same since." Then he walked out, leaving me alone with the hum of the vending machine and a knot tightening in my stomach. By the time the last film started that night, I'd gone over the rules a dozen times in my head. They were simple, sure, but the way everyone talked about them made them feel heavier, like they weren't just guidelines, they were laws. Lisa caught me staring at the clipboard during the cleanup. "They're there for a reason," she said quietly, her voice softer than usual. "Yeah, but what reason?" I asked, holding up the clipboard. "I mean, the storage room? The projection booth? It's just a theater. What's the big deal?" Her eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. "You don't have to believe me," she said, grabbing her bag, "but follow the rules. Trust me, it's easier that way." That night, I decided to do exactly what I was told. I cleaned the screens, locked the storage room, and stayed in the projection booth for the duration of the final movie. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. It wasn't anything I could explain. Not a noise or a shadow, just a presence. As I walked through the empty theater after the credits rolled, I checked each row of seats like the list instructed. No one was there, but as I turned to leave, I felt it again. The same faint whisper from the night before. This time it was louder, clearer. "Stay." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was something else beneath it. A pull, like it was trying to drag me back into the room. I ran out, locking the door behind me as fast as my shaking hands would allow. When I got back to the lobby, the lights were flickering. Lisa was already gone, and Kevin was shutting down the concession stand. "You okay?" he asked, glancing at me. "Yeah," I lied, not trusting my voice to say more. "Good," he said, flipping off the light switches. "Just don't forget the last rule." I didn't answer, couldn't. As I left the building, the buzzing sound from the night before returned. But this time, it followed me into the parking lot, growing fainter with every step I took away from the theater. The next few shifts at Crestwood Theater passed without much incident. I followed the rules, every single one. I locked the storage room, stayed in the projection booth during screenings, and double-checked the auditorium after the last showing. But that voice I'd heard, the one that told me to stay, stayed with me. It echoed in my mind at odd times, like when I was stocking candy or sweeping popcorn off the floor. Lisa didn't bring it up again, and Kevin acted like nothing strange had ever happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something they weren't telling me. Started small. One night, I went to the storage room to grab a new box of popcorn bags. The lock clicked open like usual, and I stepped inside. It was a cramped space, barely big enough to turn around in, with shelves packed high with supplies. As I reached for the box, the lights flickered, just for a second. I froze, staring at the bulb above me. It wasn't unusual for old fixtures like these to act up, but something about it felt intentional. I grabbed the box and turned to leave, but when I pulled the door open, it was heavier than I remembered. The hallway outside was empty, but the air felt different, denser, like walking through water. When I got back to the lobby, Kevin was leaning against the counter, scrolling on his phone. "Did you mess with the lights in the storage room?" I asked, half joking. He didn't even look up. "No." "Why?" "No reason," I said, brushing it off. But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something had shifted. Later that night, as the last film played, I decided to stay in the projection booth a little longer than usual. I wanted to see if the credits would glitch again like they had before. The film was a romantic drama. Nothing particularly unusual. I sat in the chair by the projector, watching the screen through the little glass window. The audience was sparse, just a handful of couples and one man sitting by himself in the back row. As the movie reached its emotional climax, I noticed something odd. The man in the back row hadn't moved the entire time. Not once. I leaned closer to the window, squinting to get a better look. His posture was stiff, and his face was tilted slightly downward, like he was staring at his lap. Probably just asleep, I muttered to myself, but then he turned his head. Slowly, I recoiled instinctively, even though I knew he couldn't see me. His face was pale, unnaturally so, and his eyes, they didn't look right. They were wide, unblinking, like they were made of glass. When the credits started rolling, I checked the seats again. The man was gone. I told Lisa about it the next day, hoping she'd reassure me, tell me it was just a trick of the light or my imagination. Instead, she said, "You'll see things here. It's best not to dwell on them." Her words didn't comfort me. If anything, they made it worse. A few nights later, I was cleaning the auditorium after the last showing. The theater was empty, or at least it should have been. As I swept the aisles, I heard a faint noise behind me. A soft creak, like someone shifting their weight in one of the seats. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I turned around slowly, scanning the rows. First, nothing seemed out of place. But then I saw it. A single seat in the middle row, folded down as if someone had just been sitting there. I hadn't missed it before. I was sure of that. "Is someone still here?" I asked louder this time. The room stayed silent, but the air felt heavy again, like it had in the storage room. I approached the seat cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got there, I saw something resting on the seat. It was a ticket stub folded neatly in half. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The printing on it was strange, almost blurry, and the date didn't make sense. It was for a movie I'd never heard of, one that wasn't on our schedule. The name of the film read, Stay. I showed the ticket stub to Kevin the next morning. "We don't sell tickets like this," he said, holding it up to the light. "Well, someone left it behind," I said. He shrugged, tossing it onto the counter. "Probably some prank. Don't let it get to you." But it did get to me. That night, things escalated. The last movie ended, and I was in the middle of sweeping when I heard the storage room door slam shut. I froze, the broom slipping from my hands. I was the only one still there. Lisa had left early, and Kevin was locking up the lobby. I approached the hallway cautiously, my shoes squeaking against the sticky floor. The storage room door was slightly ajar, its lock hanging loosely as if someone had forced it open. I reached for the handle, but before I could touch it, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the light flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the far end of the room. Then the light went out completely. The storage room door swung open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness inside. My chest felt tight, and my fingers trembled as I fumbled for the light switch. It flickered to life, casting its dim, erratic glow over the cramped space. There was no one there. The shelves stood just as they always had, lined with boxes of soda cups and cleaning supplies. But something felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, like it carried the weight of unseen eyes watching my every move. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning the corners of the room. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I thought I'd seen. It had to be a shadow, a trick of the flickering light. But then I saw it. On the floor, just beneath one of the shelves, lay a piece of paper. It looked out of place in the otherwise orderly room. I bent down to pick it up, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The paper was old, its edges frayed, and the writing on it was faded but still legible. It wasn't a memo or a supply list. It was a single sentence, scrawled in uneven, hurried handwriting. "Don't let them in." I stood frozen, staring at the words. My hands began to shake, and I felt a cold sweat trickle down my spine. What did it mean? Who wrote it? I turned around, ready to leave the room, but the door, it wasn't open anymore. It was shut, the lock turning with a faint, deliberate click. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it didn't budge. My breath quickened as I banged on the door, shouting for Kevin or Lisa, but the theater was silent. Then, in the corner of the room, I heard a faint scraping sound. I froze, my back pressed against the door. The sound was slow, deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My eyes darted to the source, but the flickering light made it hard to see clearly. "Who's there?" I managed to choke out, my voice shaking. No response. The scraping stopped, replaced by a new sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was almost like someone was knocking, but not on the walls or the door. The sound came from above me. I looked up. The ceiling light flickered once, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I scrambled to pull out my phone, fumbling with the screen until the flashlight came on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it didn't bring comfort. If anything, it made things worse. The shelves seemed taller now, their shadows stretching unnaturally. The tapping continued, and I swore I could feel vibrations under my feet, like something was moving beneath the floor. Desperation clawed at me as I tried the door again, yanking the handle with all my strength. It wouldn't budge. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Let me out." As if in response, the tapping stopped. The silence was worse. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Then, just as I began to think it was over, the paper I'd picked up earlier fluttered out of my hand. It landed face up on the floor, and I could see the writing clearly now. The words had changed. "It's too late." The door finally gave way, swinging open with a force that nearly knocked me off balance. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The theater was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights. I didn't wait for Kevin or Lisa. I grabbed my things and ran out the front doors, not stopping until I was in the safety of my car. My hands shook as I started the engine, and my heart didn't stop racing until I was miles away from the theater. The next day, I woke up with the paper still in my pocket. I'd crumpled it in my hand without realizing it, and when I smoothed it out, the writing was gone. Part of me wanted to quit, to never step foot in that theater again. But something about the whole experience pulled at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I had to know what was happening. That night I returned. When I walked into the theater that night, everything felt different. The lobby lights were dimmer than usual, casting long, stretched shadows across the walls. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for an old building like this. Kevin wasn't at the concession stand. Lisa wasn't around either. For the first time, I realized I was completely alone. I tried to brush off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Maybe they were in the break room or running late. But as I made my way toward the projection booth, I noticed something odd. The theater schedule for the night was blank. No titles, no showtimes, just an empty board where the day's films should have been listed. I found Mr. Carson in the manager's office. He was sitting at his desk, staring blankly at the small TV that monitored the security cameras. The glow of the screen lit up his face, making the dark circles under his eyes look even deeper. "Where is everyone?" I asked, stepping into the room. He didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen. "Mr. Carson?" Finally, he turned his head, moving so slowly it almost didn't seem real. His expression was hollow, like he wasn't fully awake, or maybe like he was too awake, seeing something I couldn't. "They're gone," he said quietly. "What do you mean, gone?" He pointed at the screen. "They're still in there." I leaned over his shoulder to look. The screen showed one of the auditoriums, but it didn't look right. The seats were full, but the people weren't moving. They sat perfectly still, as if frozen in time. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Carson didn't answer. He just stood up, walked past me, and left the room. I followed him to the auditorium, where the door stood slightly ajar. The faint glow of the screen spilled out into the hallway. "Mr. Carson, wait," I called, but he didn't stop. By the time I reached the door, he had already gone inside. The room was dark, save for the flickering light from the screen. The audience was just as I'd seen them on the monitor, silent, unmoving. "Mr. Carson?" I stepped inside, my voice echoing in the emptiness. He was at the front of the room, standing near the screen. He turned to face me, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. His shadow. It wasn't right. The light from the projector should have cast it long and thin, but instead, it stretched upward, distorted and impossibly tall. It wavered like smoke, as if it had a life of its own. "You should leave," he said, his voice trembling. "Before it's too late." Before I could respond, the screen went black. The sudden darkness was suffocating. I stumbled backward, reaching for the door, but it wouldn't open. Then the screen flickered back on. But it wasn't showing a movie anymore. It was showing me, not a reflection, not a live feed me, standing in the lobby, sweeping the floor, exactly as I'd done the first night I worked here. I watched as the image on the screen changed, showing scenes from my life that no one else should have known about. Moments I'd never told anyone, things I'd never spoken aloud. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was like the screen was pulling me in, demanding I watch. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The image on the screen wasn't just showing my past. It was showing the room I was standing in, the auditorium. But it wasn't empty anymore. The seats were filled with people, their faces blank and pale, their eyes wide and unblinking. They weren't watching the screen. They were watching me. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "Mr. Carson," I shouted, but he was gone. The figures in the seats began to stand, one by one, their movements slow and jerky, like marionettes on invisible strings. "Stay," they said in unison, their voices overlapping in a low, droning whisper. I bolted for the door, slamming into it with all my weight. It still wouldn't open. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, filling the room like a swarm of bees. "Stay," they repeated, the word growing sharper, almost angry. Desperation took over. I turned to the screen, hoping for some kind of answer, but it only showed one word now. "Run." I don't know how I got the door open. One moment I was clawing at the handle, and the next I was stumbling into the hallway, gasping for air. The theater was empty again. The lobby lights were on, the buzzing sound gone. But something was different. The air felt lighter, as if whatever had been there was satisfied now. I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my bag and ran out the front doors, leaving them unlocked behind me. When I got home that night, I locked every door and window in my apartment. I sat on the couch, staring at the crumpled ticket stub I'd found days earlier. The name of the movie had changed again. It now read, The Last Showing. I didn't go back to the Crestwood Theater after that night. I didn't quit either. I just stopped showing up. A week later, Lisa called me. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. You left in a hurry, she said, as if I'd just forgotten my jacket. Yeah, I replied, gripping my phone tightly. I don't think I can come back. There was a pause on her end. Then she said something that sent a chill through me. They don't like it when people leave. I hung up and blocked her number. First, I thought I could put it all behind me. I started looking for a new job, focusing on anything that didn't involve dimly lit rooms or old buildings. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was small things at first. A shadow in the corner of my eye, the sensation of someone standing too close when no one was there. At night, my dreams were vivid and strange, filled with flickering lights and faces I didn't recognize. I'd wake up gasping for air, my heart pounding, convinced I could still hear that whisper. Stay. One afternoon, I went out for groceries. The sun was bright, and for the first time in days, I felt like maybe I was finally moving on. But when I got back to my apartment, there was something waiting for me on the doormat. Ticket stub. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The printing on it was just as strange as the one I'd found in the theater. But this one had my name on it. The movie title read, Final Exit. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with all the lights on, staring at the ticket stub until the sun came up. I told myself it was a prank, that someone was messing with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Over the next few days, the ticket stub wasn't the only thing that followed me. I'd hear faint whispers when I was alone, feel a cold draft in rooms with no open windows. And then there were the knocks. They started late at night, always soft and slow. First, I ignored them, but as the nights went on, they grew louder, more insistent. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the door, half expecting to see Lisa or Kevin standing there with some ridiculous explanation. But there was no one, just the hallway, empty and silent. I stepped outside, looking both ways. Nothing. But when I turned to go back inside, I froze. The ticket stub was on the floor again, right in front of my door. Only this time it wasn't folded. The back of it was blank except for one sentence, written in the same uneven handwriting I'd seen in the storage room. We're not finished. It's been 2 months since I left Crestwood Theater. I've moved twice since then, each time hoping I could outrun whatever it is that's following me. But the whispers haven't stopped. Neither have the ticket stubs. Every time I hear a knock at my door, I freeze, just in case. I don't know what they want. I don't know why they picked me. All I know is that I should have listened to Lisa. I should have followed the rules. Because now, no matter where I go, it feels like I never really left. Ready for more chills and mysteries? Subscribe and turn on the bell. You never know what story is coming next. I hadn't planned to be at work so late on Christmas Eve. It just sort of happened. The library, usually buzzing with quiet chatter and the faint tapping of keyboards, was eerily silent now. Everyone else had gone home hours ago, leaving me alone to finish the last few tasks that I couldn't justify putting off until after the holidays. The heater in the corner rattled faintly, pushing out warm air that didn't quite reach the drafty edges of the room. Outside, snowflakes drifted down in slow spirals, blanketing the streets and muffling any sound from the world beyond the windows. The street lamps cast long, orange-hued shadows that stretched across the empty parking lot. It was peaceful, I told myself, quiet, but something about it didn't feel quite right. I pulled my cardigan tighter around me and checked my watch. 11:45 p.m. Just a few more minutes, I thought, and then I'd head home. But first, I had to finish reshelving the books stacked on the cart next to me. Fiction, non-fiction, biographies, children's stories. It was a task I'd done 100 times before, one I could do in my sleep if I had to. But tonight, it felt heavier somehow, like the air in the room was pressing down on me. I hummed softly to myself, an old habit to fill the silence, but even that didn't help. The sound seemed too loud, bouncing off the walls of the empty library. I stopped and listened, unsure of what I was expecting to hear. Nothing. Just the hum of the heater and the occasional groan of the old building settling into the cold. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. As I reached for the last book on the cart, a tattered copy of A Christmas Carol, I couldn't help but smile. Felt fitting for the night. I placed it back on the shelf, brushing a bit of dust from its spine, and turned to grab my coat. That's when I noticed it, the faintest sound, just at the edge of hearing. A melody, soft and lilting, like someone humming a Christmas carol. At first, I thought it might be coming from my own head, a leftover tune from earlier in the day. But it didn't stop. It grew clearer, more distinct. I froze, straining to hear it. The sound wasn't coming from inside the library. It was outside, beyond the frosted windows. I stepped closer, peering into the night, but all I saw was the snow-covered street, empty and still. The melody continued, a familiar tune I couldn't quite name, like it was just out of reach in my memory. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. Get a grip, I muttered to myself. It's Christmas Eve, and I've been here too long. I grabbed my bag and coat, determined to put the strange feeling behind me. But as I reached the library door, I hesitated. Something about the night felt off. The kind of off you can't put your finger on but can't ignore either. The carol, if that's what it was, faded, and for a moment I thought it had stopped altogether. But then it started again, a little louder this time, like it was moving closer. I tightened my grip on the door handle, heart pounding now. It wasn't fear exactly, just unease. Like the kind you feel when you're walking alone at night and hear footsteps behind you. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, but of course, I was still alone. The library felt colder suddenly, the warmth from the heater now a distant memory. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to shake it off. It's just the wind, I told myself. Or maybe someone on the next street playing music loud enough to carry through the stillness. Either way, it wasn't my concern. Couldn't be. The lights flickered briefly as I stepped out into the night. I shivered, pulling my coat tight against the cold. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way to my car, and for a moment, the world seemed utterly silent again. But as I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, there it was, the faint sound of carols, still playing somewhere in the distance. I didn't know why it unsettled me so much. After all, it's Christmas. Who wouldn't be playing carols on a night like this? But as I pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't help but glance back at the library one last time. The windows glowed softly, their light spilling out onto the snow. For a second, I thought I saw a shadow move across one of them, but when I blinked, it was gone. I drove home that night with the melody still circling in my head. I wanted to let it go, to shrug it off as some odd little detail my tired mind was over-focusing on. Maybe a neighbor, I thought. Someone celebrating with their family late into the night. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The sound had followed me. Not literally, but close enough that I couldn't convince myself it wasn't important. The next morning, I arrived at the library feeling restless. The warmth of the day had softened the snow, leaving slushy puddles in the parking lot. Everything seemed ordinary again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease from the night before. My first task was the same as usual. Unlock the doors, check the thermostat, and make sure the shelves were tidy before the first visitors arrived. But as I reached for the logbook to sign in, I noticed something unusual. There was a note tucked inside, written in a precise, almost too perfect handwriting. Please ensure the back exit is locked before leaving at night. This is important. I frowned. The back exit was always locked automatically. It was part of the system. Still, I decided to check the door later just to make sure. I reminded myself that this was likely just a formality, but the phrasing of the note stuck with me. This is important. The words felt heavier than they needed to be. The morning passed without incident, busy enough to distract me for a while. Parents brought in children for story hour. Students wandered through, looking for books they'd procrastinated finding for their winter break assignments. By noon, the library hummed with quiet activity. It was comforting, in a way, to see the space full of life again. Then I saw Mr. Grayson. Mr. Grayson, the janitor, was an older man, gruff but kind in his way. I'd seen him countless times cleaning the floors or wiping down windows without a word. But today he seemed different. As I passed him in the hallway, he stopped abruptly, fixing me with a look I couldn't quite interpret. Make sure you follow the rules, he said, his voice low. I blinked. What rules? He hesitated, as though he wanted to say more but couldn't. Just the usual. Lock up properly. Don't stay late. You don't want to forget. Forget what? I asked, half laughing to mask my discomfort. He didn't answer. He simply nodded toward the back exit before walking away, his steps fading into the hallway. Later that day, I decided to take another look at the back exit. The note from the morning and Mr. Grayson's odd behavior had planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't ignore. The door was locked, as I'd expected, but I found myself lingering there, staring at the heavy metal frame. There was nothing unusual about it. No signs of tampering, no strange sounds. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt an inexplicable sense of unease. It was as if the door itself was waiting. Shaking off the thought, I double-checked the lock and returned to the front desk. As the day wore on, I started to notice other little things. Details I wouldn't usually think twice about, but now couldn't stop analyzing. For instance, the way some of the older staff spoke about the library, as though it were more than just a building. There's a history here, one of them had told me when I first started. It's got character. At the time, I'd thought they meant the creaky floors and the antique furniture. Now, I wasn't so sure. I also began to pay attention to the unwritten rules everyone seemed to follow, even though no one had ever formally explained them to me. Don't stay past 11 p.m. unless absolutely necessary. Always check the lights before locking up. The older wiring can be finicky. Make sure the upstairs archives are locked, even if no one has been up there all day. The more I thought about it, the more these rules seemed oddly specific. They were presented as practical guidelines, but the seriousness with which people followed them suggested something more. I started to wonder if there was a reason beyond mere practicality. That evening, as I prepared to leave, I found myself lingering again by the back exit. The carol from the night before was still on my mind. I half expected to hear it again as I locked the door, but the air outside was completely still. I glanced back at the library before heading to my car, and that's when I saw it. A light flickering in the upstairs archives. My stomach tightened. No one had been up there all day. I hesitated, debating whether to go back in. It's just the wiring, I told myself, but the thought wasn't convincing. When I finally got into my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something important. The next day, I decided to ask a coworker, Lisa, about the rules. She'd been working at the library for years and always seemed like the type who knew more than she let on. Do you ever feel like some of these rules are strange? I asked her casually as we sorted through a pile of returned books. She looked at me for a moment, her expression carefully neutral. What do you mean? Like the back exit thing? Or the archives? Do we really need to check them so often? Lisa hesitated, her hands pausing mid-motion. It's just how things are, she said finally. You don't want to mess with routine here. Why not? She opened her mouth to reply, then stopped. Instead, she gave me a tight smile. You'll understand eventually. That night, as I locked up the library, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. There was a weight to them, something unsaid that hung in the air like the faint scent of dust in the archives. I walked to the back exit one last time, checking the lock as always. But this time, I noticed something new. A faint scuff mark on the floor, as though someone had dragged their heel across the tiles. It led to the door and stopped abruptly, just like the footprints in the snow the night before. The air felt colder suddenly, the kind of cold that creeps in without warning. I shivered and stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint hum, just like the night before. But when I strained to listen, the sound was gone. That night I couldn't sleep. The scuff marks near the back exit replayed in my mind like a puzzle I couldn't solve. It was such a small thing, really, but it lingered, twisting into something bigger the more I thought about it. And that faint hum, was it real? Or was my imagination working overtime? I kept telling myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew I didn't believe that. Something about the library felt wrong. Not in an obvious way, but in the way a crooked painting on the wall can throw off the whole room. By the time I returned to work the next day, my unease had grown into full-blown suspicion. I wasn't looking for anything unusual, not exactly, but I couldn't stop myself from noticing every little detail that didn't feel quite right. The first thing was the logbook. When I opened it to sign in, I noticed that someone had scribbled out their entry from the previous night. A name and a time, now nothing but a black smear of ink. Lisa, I called out as she walked by. Did you notice this? She glanced at the logbook, her expression unreadable. Happens sometimes, she said. People make mistakes. Doesn't it seem odd? She shrugged, but her movements were stiff, guarded. Maybe, or maybe you're just overthinking things. Later that morning, I decided to take another look at the upstairs archives. I'd been avoiding them since the flickering light the other night, but something kept pulling me back there. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The air felt heavier up here, colder somehow. I reached for the key in my pocket, but as my hand brushed the doorknob, I froze. It was already unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it the night before. Positive. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find someone inside. But the room was empty, just rows of shelves stacked with dusty books and old newspapers. The light was on, flickering faintly. I stepped inside, my breath visible in the frigid air. The room smelled different, mustier than usual, with a faint metallic tang that made my stomach turn. I walked the length of the shelves, my footsteps muffled by the thin carpet, but I didn't find anything out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept drifting back to the archives. Who had unlocked the door, and why? That evening, as I prepared to close up, I lingered by the back exit again. The scuff marks were still there, faint but undeniable. I crouched down for a closer look, running my fingers over the floor. The marks looked fresher now, as though someone had been there recently. The faint hum returned, so soft I wasn't sure if I was hearing it or imagining it. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. The sound wasn't coming from outside this time. It was coming from inside the library. I turned toward the stacks, the shadows between the shelves stretching long and dark. The hum grew louder, becoming a melody. A carol. I followed the sound, my steps hesitant but deliberate. It led me to the children's section, where the small reading chairs sat in a neat circle around a rug decorated with colorful animals. The sound stopped as soon as I entered. I looked around, scanning the rows of books and the empty chairs. There was nothing out of place, nothing that explained the music. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. By the time I locked up and left, I was thoroughly shaken. The night was cold and still, the snow crunching under my boots as I walked to my car. I didn't hear the carols again, but the quiet felt wrong, too perfect. When I got home, I tried to shake it off. I made tea, turned on the TV, and did my best to distract myself, but none of it worked. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flickering light in the archives, the scuff marks by the back exit, and the empty children's section where the music had stopped. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When it finally did, I dreamed of the library. I was back in the archives, but this time the door wouldn't open. I could hear the carols again, louder and clearer than before, but they weren't coming from outside. They were coming from behind the shelves. I woke up in a cold sweat, the melody still echoing in my mind. The next day, I arrived at the library early. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I needed to be there to figure out what was happening. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt it again, that heaviness in the air, like the building itself was holding its breath. Lisa was already at the desk, her eyes darting up briefly as I walked in. "You're here early," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to sound casual. She didn't say anything, but the way she avoided my gaze told me she knew more than she was letting on. As the day went on, I started noticing more inconsistencies. A door that should have been locked was ajar. A book I distinctly remembered shelving was back on the cart. The logbook now had another entry scratched out, this time so heavily that the paper was torn. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was just my imagination. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it felt like the library itself was pushing back, demanding my attention. By the time evening rolled around, I was dreading the thought of locking up. But as much as I wanted to leave early, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to stay, to see it through. The library had never felt so alive in its silence. Every shadow seemed to stretch farther than it should. Every creak of the wooden floors felt like a whisper from something unseen. By the time night fell, I could barely keep myself from jumping at every small sound. I'd planned to leave early, to lock up and put the strange events behind me, but something wouldn't let me. Or maybe I wouldn't let myself. Part of me needed to know what was happening here. Why did it feel like the library had suddenly started breathing? Lisa had left an hour earlier, offering me a brief, uneasy smile before disappearing into the cold night. "Be careful," she'd said, almost as an afterthought. I wasn't sure if she meant the icy roads or something else entirely. Now, alone in the dim light of the desk lamp, I sat staring at the logbook. Another name had been scratched out earlier in the day. I hadn't asked Lisa about it this time. I already knew she wouldn't give me a straight answer. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second echoing louder in the stillness. It was nearing 11 p.m., the time everyone said you shouldn't stay past. I told myself I'd finish one last task and then head home. I stood and walked toward the back exit, my footsteps hesitant but steady. The scuff marks on the floor were still there, more pronounced now as though someone had traced over them. I checked the lock, it was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just beyond the edge of my vision. As I turned to head back to the front desk, I froze. The faint sound of a carol drifted through the air, soft and distant. Silent Night. My chest tightened. It was the same melody I'd heard 2 nights ago. The same hauntingly slow tune. Only this time, it didn't seem to be coming from outside. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. It led me to the children's section again, where the small chairs sat in their familiar circle. The melody grew louder as I approached, and I could feel the air grow colder with every step. When I reached the edge of the circle, the music stopped. Silence fell heavy and oppressive. I looked around, scanning the rows of shelves, but there was no one there. That's when I saw it. One of the chairs wasn't empty anymore. Sitting there, perfectly still, was a small, stuffed bear. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. The little thing was worn, its fur matted and one of its eyes missing, but it was unmistakably there. I stared at it, my mind racing. Who had put it there? And how? I backed away, the hair on my arms standing on end. I didn't hear the footsteps until I was halfway to the front desk. They were faint, but distinct, soft, deliberate, and coming from the direction I had just left. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The children's section was empty, just as I'd left it. The stuffed bear sat in its chair, as motionless as before. "Hello!" My voice barely carried, trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. The footsteps stopped. I didn't run, though every instinct screamed at me to do so. Instead, I forced myself to move slowly, deliberately, back toward the front desk. If I could just lock up and leave, I told myself, everything would be fine. But when I reached the desk, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The logbook was open, even though I'd left it closed. A new name had been written at the bottom of the page in the same sharp, precise handwriting as the note I'd found earlier in the week. 11:15 p.m., locked the back exit. Everything is in place. My heart raced as I stared at the entry. The ink was still wet. I turned to grab my keys, but they weren't where I'd left them. The desk drawer was slightly open, its contents scattered as though someone had been rummaging through it. The lights flickered, plunging the library into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, like the space itself had shifted. I decided to check the archives one last time. Maybe it was irrational, but I couldn't leave without knowing if something or someone was up there. The stairs creaked louder this time, the sound echoing like gunshots in the empty building. When I reached the door, it was already ajar, swinging gently as though it had been pushed just moments before. I stepped inside, my hands trembling. The room was colder than I remembered, and the metallic smell from before was stronger now, almost suffocating. I moved slowly through the rows of shelves, my footsteps muffled by the thin carpet. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed it, the stuffed bear. It was sitting on the floor in the far corner of the room, its single eye staring at me. I froze, a chill running down my spine. The bear hadn't been there before. Couldn't have been. I reached out, hesitant, and picked it up. The fur was rough and damp, as though it had been left outside in the snow. I turned it over in my hands, my mind racing with questions. That's when the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening in the small room, reverberating through the air. I dropped the bear, spinning around to face the door. It was locked. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light illuminated the shelves, the floor, and finally the door. There was no one there, no shadow, no movement. But then I heard it again, the carol. Silent Night. This time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I turned slowly, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The shelves were empty, just rows of books and dust. But the melody didn't stop. It grew louder, filling the room, until it was all I could hear. I don't remember running. All I know is that somehow I made it back to the front desk. The logbook was still open, the new entry staring back at me like a taunt. I grabbed my bag and ran out the door, leaving the library behind. The snow crunched under my boots as I reached my car, my breath visible in the freezing air. I didn't look back. I didn't go back to the library the next day, or the day after that. I called Lisa and told her I was sick, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't press for details, and I was grateful for it. I didn't know how to explain what had happened, and even if I tried, I wasn't sure I'd believe it myself. The days blurred together after that. I spent most of my time at home, curtains drawn, the soft glow of the TV filling the room. But even then, the silence felt heavy. Too heavy. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the wind outside my window, it all sounded wrong. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. The bear, the door, the carols, they were just coincidences. They had to be. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. A week later, Lisa called me. "Are you coming back?" she asked, her tone light but cautious. I hesitated. I don't think so. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're not the first, you know. People leave. They don't always say why, but I can guess." "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach twisting. Another pause. "The library's old. It has its quirks. Not everyone can handle them. Quirks. That's what she called them. Like the scuff marks on the floor, the logbook entries, the bear, the music. Like all of that could be written off as just some harmless oddities." I didn't push her for more. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it anyway. Even though I never went back, the library stayed with me. Little things would remind me of it. A faint melody on the radio, the sound of snow crunching underfoot, the flicker of a light bulb. And every time, I'd feel that same cold weight settle over me, like a shadow passing too close. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad experience, something I'd eventually move past. But late at night, when the world was quiet, I'd hear it again. The carol, soft and distant, like it was coming from just outside my window. One night, months later, I finally worked up the courage to look. The street was empty just like before. No footprints in the snow. No glowing lights. Nothing. But the music didn't stop. It grew louder, clearer, until I was sure it wasn't just in my head. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the dark, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The music just stopped as suddenly as it had started. I went back inside, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. I still think about the library sometimes, about the archives, the bear, the scuff marks on the floor. I think about Lisa's words, the way she seemed to know something but wouldn't say it. And I wonder if I should have stayed, if I should have tried harder to understand what was happening. But then I remember the sound of that door slamming shut, the weight of the silence that followed, and I know I made the right choice. Now, whenever I hear a Christmas carol, my breath catches. Just for a second. It doesn't matter where I am, at a store, in my car, even at home. For that moment, I'm back in the library, standing in the archives, with the air so cold it burns my lungs. Most days I can shake it off. I tell myself it's just a memory, that it can't hurt me anymore. But every once in a while, I feel that same heaviness in the air, that same weight pressing down on me. And I wonder, what if it's not over? Subscribe for more horror stories every day. The first thing you notice about a place like this isn't the eerie silence or the faint smell of mildew. It's the way the darkness feels. Heavy, like it's pressing down on you, daring you to turn back. That's what hit me as soon as I stepped into the lobby of the Cross Hill Motel. It was supposed to be a quick gig, an easy paycheck, But within minutes, I knew I'd walked into something far from ordinary. I should have known better. When you're broke and desperate, you convince yourself to overlook certain red flags. Like why a motel in the middle of nowhere would offer a paycheck so generous it felt too good to be true. Or why they didn't ask for references or much of anything when I applied. I could almost hear my mom's voice in my head as I signed the contract. Nothing in life comes without a price. Kid, I didn't realize just how right she was until that night. The Cross Hill Motel wasn't your average roadside inn. Sure, it had the usual faded neon sign flickering, vacancy, and a gravel parking lot with a couple of beat-up trucks. But there was something off about it. The lobby was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb that hummed louder than it should have. The wallpaper, once cream-colored, had aged into a sickly yellow. A lone desk bell sat on the counter, its metal dulled with age, but no one came to greet me when I rang it. The silence was unnerving. It wasn't the peaceful kind, like when you're alone with your thoughts. This was the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every little sound. Your own breathing, the creak of the wooden floorboards under your weight, the faint rustle of something you couldn't see. As I stood there, waiting for someone to appear, I started questioning my decision. But then I reminded myself why I was here in the first place. Rent was due, bills were piling up, and I didn't have many options. The Cross Hill Motel had offered me a job when no one else would. First shift. The voice came from behind me, making me jump. I spun around to see a wiry old man standing there, holding a ring of keys that jangled with every step. He looked me over like he was sizing me up, then tossed the keys onto the counter with a smirk. "You're braver than most," he said. I forced a smile, pretending I wasn't unnerved. "Just here to do the job." He raised an eyebrow. "Well, let's see if you last the night." He didn't wait for me to respond, just slid a piece of paper across the counter. It was a list of rules, handwritten in shaky block letters. Always lock the front door after 10 p.m. Don't go into room 6 for any reason. If you hear footsteps in the hallway but don't see anyone, don't look for them. Under no circumstances should you answer the phone after midnight. I stared at the list, half expecting him to laugh and say it was some sort of initiation joke. But his expression stayed dead serious. "What happens if I break one?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He shrugged. "You don't want to find out." Part of me wanted to walk out right then and there, leave the keys on the counter and pretend this whole thing never happened. But then I thought about my landlord banging on my door and the empty pantry waiting for me at home. "You can do this," I told myself. "It's just one night." I shoved the rules into my pocket and tried not to let my nerves show as the old man disappeared into the night. Now it was just me and the motel. The night started out uneventful. I did what I was supposed to. Checked the locks, flipped through an old logbook, and tried to keep myself busy. But around 11 p.m., things started to feel strange. It wasn't any one thing I could point to, more like a feeling. Like the air had shifted, growing colder even though the thermostat hadn't changed. The hum of the overhead bulb sounded more like a whisper now, low and insistent. And then I heard it, footsteps. They were faint at first, barely noticeable, but they grew louder with each passing second. Slow, deliberate steps moving down the hallway just beyond the lobby. I froze, my pulse quickening. Stay calm, I thought. It's probably just one of the guests. But when I stepped to the edge of the counter and peeked into the hallway, there was no one there. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the strange atmosphere get to me. But as I turned back to the desk, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the lobby's glass door. A shadow. It wasn't mine. That's when I remembered the old man's warning. "Let's see if you last the night." I'd brushed it off earlier, but now those words echoed in my mind. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't normal. and I had a sinking feeling I'd barely scratched the surface of what this job had in store for me. As I sat back down at the desk, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, I glanced at the list of rules again. This time, they didn't seem ridiculous. They felt like the only thing keeping me alive. The list of rules sat on the desk in front of me, its edges worn and curling like it had been handled 100 times before. The handwriting was uneven, almost frantic, as if whoever wrote it was in a hurry or scared. I had read through them once already, but my eyes kept going back to one line. If you hear footsteps in the hallway but don't see anyone, don't look for them. I couldn't stop thinking about the sound I'd heard earlier. The slow, deliberate steps that had echoed through the empty corridor. I convinced myself it was nothing, just old pipes or the wind shifting the building. But now, with the list of rules in front of me, it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like a warning. The old man hadn't explained much before leaving. He tossed me the keys, mumbled something about locking the door at 10 p.m., and disappeared into the night. No introductions, no tour, no reassurance, just me, the motel, and these rules. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. It was almost midnight now, and the unease that had crept in earlier was digging its claws deeper. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't see but could definitely feel. I leaned back in the creaky chair behind the desk, reading the rules again. Always lock the front door after 10 p.m. Don't go into room 6 for any reason. If you hear footsteps in the hallway but don't see anyone, don't look for them. Under no circumstances should you answer the phone after midnight. It didn't make sense. Why would a motel of all places have rules like this? What could possibly happen in room 6? And why would answering the phone be dangerous? I shook my head and muttered under my breath, "This place is insane," but the truth was I wasn't laughing. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the phone on the desk rang. I jumped so hard that I nearly knocked over the chair. My heart hammered as the shrill sound filled the empty lobby. It was the old-fashioned kind of phone with a rotary dial and a cracked receiver. I stared at it, frozen. My first instinct was to pick it up. It's just a phone, after all. But then I remembered the rule. Under no circumstances should you answer the phone after midnight. The ringing seemed to grow louder, sharper, like it was daring me to break the rule. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay put. Don't answer it. Just let it ring. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the ringing stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. It felt heavier, almost suffocating. I let out a shaky breath and sat back down, trying to convince myself I'd done the right thing. But a part of me couldn't help wondering, what would have happened if I'd answered? As I tried to calm my nerves, I noticed something sticking out from under the desk blotter. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. I pulled it out and unfolded it carefully, revealing more shaky handwriting. The note was short, but it sent a chill down my spine. The rules are for your protection. Do not break them. Trust me. I frowned, turning the paper over, but there was nothing else. No signature, no explanation, just those haunting words. My protection? From what? I looked around the empty lobby, the flickering bulb overhead casting long shadows against the walls. The building creaked faintly, like it was settling, but it felt more alive than it should have. Great, I muttered. Now I'm paranoid. I decided to check the guest log, hoping it would distract me. The leather-bound book was thick, its pages filled with names, dates, and room assignments written in neat columns. Most of the entries were old, some going back decades. As I flipped through the pages, one thing stood out: Room 6. Unlike the other rooms, which had consistent entries over the years, Room 6 seemed to have long gaps where no one stayed there. The last entry was over 2 years ago, and even that one had been scratched out so violently the paper was torn. I ran my finger over the damaged page, a knot forming in my stomach. Something had happened in that room, something they didn't want anyone to know about. The quiet of the motel was suddenly broken by a loud thud from upstairs. It wasn't subtle, more like something heavy being dropped. I froze, listening intently. The thud was followed by a scraping sound, like furniture being dragged across the floor. The problem was, there shouldn't have been anyone upstairs. I hadn't checked anyone into the motel since I arrived. My first instinct was to grab the keys and investigate, but then I remembered the rules. If you hear footsteps in the hallway but don't see anyone, don't look for them. I wasn't sure if this counted as footsteps, but the thought of breaking the rules sent a shiver down my spine. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight from under the desk and aimed it toward the staircase. The beam of light barely reached the top of the stairs, but I didn't see anything out of place. "Hello!" I called out, my voice unsteady. No answer. I spent the next hour jumping at every little noise. The pipes groaned, the wind rattled the windows, and every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake it, no matter how many times I checked the locks or peered out the window. It was like the shadows themselves were alive, shifting and stretching just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just a creepy old building. It was something more. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the phone rang again. This time, I didn't jump. I didn't even move. I just stared at it, my mind racing. What if it wasn't a threat? What if it was someone trying to warn me about something worse? But before I could decide, the ringing stopped. And then, somewhere in the distance, I heard it again, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps in the hallway. This time, they didn't stop. They were coming closer. The lights flickered once, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed the lobby, and the quiet that followed wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. I clutched the receiver in my hand, my breath shallow, my pulse racing. The phone was dead, but the voice I'd heard still echoed in my ears. "You shouldn't have answered." A faint sound broke through the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was close, too close. It was the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, and not mine. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The breathing stopped. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. When the beam of light finally cut through the darkness, the lobby looked the same as before, but it felt different. The list of rules was still on the desk. I grabbed it, clutching it like it could protect me. My eyes scanned the paper, desperate for something I'd missed, something that could help me. And then I heard it, footsteps, not faint this time, heavy, deliberate, coming down the hallway toward the lobby. I backed up instinctively, the flashlight beam jittering against the walls. My heart pounded as the footsteps grew louder. They stopped just outside the lobby door. I held my breath, praying that whoever or whatever it was would go away. But then the doorknob turned. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to stay steady. I aimed it toward the doorway, expecting to see a person, an animal, anything. But there was nothing there. The door swung shut with a soft click, and the footsteps started again, this time circling the desk. I spun around, the flashlight beam following the sound. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. And then, as if in answer, a deep, guttural whisper filled the room. "Why are you here?" My chest tightened. The flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. Tall, shadowy, its features blurred. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This can't be real. It's not real. But it was. The figure moved toward me, slow and deliberate. I turned and ran, The list of rules crumpled in my fist. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. The hallway stretched out in front of me. The doors to the rooms on either side closed and silent. But when I reached room 6, I stopped. The door was wide open. I knew I wasn't supposed to go inside. The rules had been clear, but the sound of footsteps behind me pushed me forward. I stepped into the room, slamming the door shut behind me. The room was cold, unnaturally cold. The curtains fluttered gently, even though the windows were shut. The smell of metal and decay filled the air, making me gag. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room stood an old mirror, its surface warped and cracked. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't right. My eyes in the mirror weren't mine. They were dark, hollow, filled with something that didn't belong to me. And then my reflection smiled. A slow, sinister grin that sent chills down my spine. "Why did you come here?" it asked, the voice deep and inhuman. "I didn't mean to," I whispered. You broke the rules." The mirror shattered, the sound deafening in the small room. Shards of glass flew toward me, but instead of hitting the floor, they hovered in the air, spinning slowly. The pieces began to reassemble, forming a shape, something that wasn't human. Its face was featureless, its body made of jagged edges and shadows. It stepped toward me, the room growing colder with each movement. I backed up until I hit the wall, my breathing ragged. "Please," I begged. "I'll leave. I won't come back. Just let me go." The figure tilted its head, as if considering my words. "You are already part of this," it said, its voice like nails on glass. "There is no leaving." The door behind me flew open, and I didn't hesitate. I ran. The hallway felt longer than before, the air thick and heavy. The footsteps were back, echoing behind me, faster now, more frantic. I burst into the lobby, my flashlight flickering wildly. The list of rules lay on the desk, untouched, as if mocking me. I grabbed it, my eyes scanning for anything that could help. A new line had appeared at the bottom of the page. "Once they see you, they will never stop." The phone rang. I ignored it. The footsteps were getting closer. I could feel the cold seeping into the room, the lights dimming. The motel was alive now, feeding off my fear, its walls pulsing like a heartbeat. I didn't know where to go or what to do. All I knew was that I was running out of time. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, the air thick with an unnatural chill. I clutched the crumpled list of rules in my hand, its corners digging into my palm as if grounding me in the reality of this nightmare. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that replaced them was worse. It was alive, a tangible void pressing against my eardrums. Room 6. Its door stood ajar, a black maw inviting me into its depths. I knew better than to enter, but the relentless whispers behind me left no choice. They were closing in, suffocating, driving me forward. I crossed the threshold, slamming the door shut behind me. The room's temperature dropped instantly, my breath visible in short, panicked bursts. The furnishings were sparse, nondescript. A bed, a nightstand, a cracked lamp. But in the corner stood a mirror, ancient and tarnished, its surface rippling like disturbed water. I avoided my reflection, instinctively knowing I wouldn't like what I saw. Instead, I scanned the room for anything, a weapon, an exit, a clue. But the room offered nothing but its oppressive atmosphere and the steady hum of the mirror, now pulsating softly, like a heartbeat. "Why are you here?" The voice was guttural, disembodied, vibrating through the walls. I spun around, flashlight beam darting wildly. No one, just the mirror, its surface now glowing faintly, distorting the room's reflection. My knees buckled as I caught a glimpse of my own image. I stared back, but it wasn't me. The eyes were black voids, the mouth curled in a grotesque smile. And then it spoke. "You broke the rules." I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "I didn't mean to," I whispered, my voice trembling. I didn't know." The figure in the mirror tilted its head, mimicking my movements with eerie precision. "Once you're seen, there is no escape." The glass cracked, thin lines spidering across its surface. My reflection fragmented, each shard showing a different version of me. Screaming, crying, silent with empty eyes. And then, with a deafening shatter, the mirror exploded. Shards hovered in the air, suspended, spinning slowly like a macabre constellation. From the fragments emerged a shape, a figure composed of jagged glass and shadow. It towered over me, faceless yet undeniably aware. The room seemed to contract around it, the walls bending inward, pulling me closer to the entity. I bolted for the door, my hand grasping the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The metal was freezing, burning my skin. Behind me, the creature moved, its presence filling the room with an unbearable weight. "You can't leave," it hissed, its voice like grinding glass. "You belong here now." Desperation surged through me. I yanked the door with all my strength, and suddenly, it gave way. I stumbled into the hallway, the sound of shattering glass echoing behind me. The motel groaned, its walls pulsating as if alive, angry at my escape. I ran blindly, the rules still clutched in my hand. My flashlight flickered, casting fleeting glimpses of the warped hallway. Doors slammed shut as I passed, the whispers growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony of rage. The lobby was ahead, its dim light a beacon in the darkness. I burst through the door, tripping over the desk chair and sprawling onto the floor. The list of rules slipped from my grasp, fluttering to the ground. A new line had appeared, written in the same shaky hand. "Once they see you, they will never stop." The phone rang. I froze, my body paralyzed by the sound. It rang again, each shrill tone slicing through the heavy silence. My eyes locked onto it, the cracked receiver trembling on the desk. "Don't," I whispered to myself. "Don't answer it." The ringing stopped. For a brief moment the lobby was silent, still, and then the shadows moved. They coalesced, pooling into a form that stood just beyond the desk. It had no features, just a void where its face should be. The whispers returned, low and insidious, crawling under my skin. "You should have stayed," it said. I scrambled to my feet, backing toward the door. The figure didn't follow, but its presence pressed against me, a suffocating force that promised I wouldn't get far. The night air hit me like a slap as I stumbled outside. I didn't look back. The gravel crunched under my feet as I ran, my lungs burning, my mind screaming at me to keep going. The motel's sign flickered in the distance, its vacancy light sputtering one last time before plunging into darkness. Even as I reached the main road, the feeling lingered, that I was being watched, that the motel wasn't finished with me. Weeks later, I still can't sleep. Shadows move where they shouldn't, and the whispers haven't stopped. I know now that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. If you ever see a place like Cross Hill Motel, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back. Because once they see you, they will never let you go. Subscribe for more horror stories every day. I arrived at the lighthouse just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The boatman barely said a word as he helped me unload my bags, his eyes fixed on the darkening sea. When I tried to thank him, he only muttered something I couldn't quite hear before pushing off and rowing back toward the mainland. I stood there, alone, with the wind tugging at my jacket and the waves crashing against the rocks. The lighthouse rose before me, taller and more worn than I expected. Its white paint was peeling, and the metal railing around the top was rusted, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of salt and mildew. The small entryway was cluttered with old furniture and tools, things left behind by the last keeper. A dusty clock hung crooked on the wall, its hands frozen at 3:17. I dropped my bags and looked around, trying to take it all in. The place was colder than I thought it would be, even with the thick stone walls. Every sound seemed louder in the emptiness. The groan of the wooden floor, the faint whistle of the wind squeezing through cracks in the windows. On the table near the stairs, I noticed a leather-bound journal, its cover worn and edges frayed. It was open to a page with a few short sentences scrawled in uneven handwriting. Keep the light on. Don't leave after dark. Listen to the ocean. I stared at the words for a moment, trying to understand what they meant. Keep the light on, that made sense. But the rest? I brushed it off as some cryptic note from the previous keeper and closed the journal. The stairs to the living quarters creaked as I climbed, the sound echoing through the tower. My room was small but functional. A bed, a desk, and a single window that looked out over the ocean. I dropped my bags in the corner and sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. It wasn't the kind of quiet I'd imagined. There was no peace to it, no comfort. Instead, it felt heavy, like the air was pressing in on me. Somewhere outside, the waves crashed, their rhythm constant and unchanging. But every now and then, I thought I heard something else. A faint, low sound, almost like a voice carried on the wind. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. The wind, I told myself, is just the wind. But even as I lay down, pulling the blanket up to my chin, the sound lingered in the back of my mind. And for the first time, I wondered if coming here had been a mistake. The first morning at the lighthouse started early. I woke to the sound of gulls crying and the light breaking through the small window. The night had been restless. Every creak of the tower, every gust of wind outside, seemed magnified in the silence. I rubbed my eyes and tried to shake off the weight of uneasy dreams. The kitchen was cramped, with an old stove and a single chair pushed against the wall. I found a stack of papers on the counter, held together by a rusted clip. It was a list, written in the same uneven handwriting as the journal I'd seen the night before. Daily procedures. Check the light mechanism at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. Maintain the fuel levels. Record the weather conditions hourly. Keep the tower locked at night. At the bottom, in bold letters, it read, "Do not leave the tower after dark. Never ignore the ocean." I set the paper down and leaned back against the counter, staring at the last two lines. The practical instructions made sense. But the others, they weren't just strange. They felt wrong. As I went about my morning routine, I tried not to dwell on it. There were other things to focus on. Figuring out how the light worked, testing the backup systems, and settling into the rhythm of the job. But the strangeness kept creeping in. When I went to inspect the lantern room, I found a pair of gloves resting on the railing outside. They were soaked through, as if someone had been standing there in the rain, but the skies had been clear all morning. I told myself it must have been left by the last keeper, though I couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't been there when I arrived. By mid-afternoon, I decided to explore the rest of the tower. Most of it was unremarkable. Tight staircases, narrow hallways, and storage rooms filled with old equipment. But near the base of the tower, I found a small room I hadn't noticed before. It was dark and smelled of damp stone. Inside, there was a chalkboard covered in faint markings, smudged over time. At the bottom, someone had etched a single sentence. "The ocean calls everyone eventually." I felt a chill crawl up my spine and left the room quickly, pretending I hadn't seen it. As the day went on, I tried to lose myself in the tasks. Cleaning the lantern, writing down the weather patterns, and checking the fuel levels. There was something comforting about the routine, even if it felt overly strict. But by evening, the quiet had returned, heavier than before. I was sitting at the kitchen table, eating a simple dinner of canned soup, when I heard it again. The sound I'd noticed the night before. The low, almost rhythmic noise just beneath the crashing waves. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, and strained to hear. It wasn't the wind. I was sure of that now. It was deeper, more deliberate, like a voice just out of reach. For a moment, I considered opening the door, stepping out onto the rocks, and listening closer. But then I remembered the rules. Don't leave the tower after dark. The words seemed to echo in my mind, louder than they had any right to. Later that night, I found myself sitting by the desk in my room, staring out at the dark sea. The lantern's beam swept across the water in steady intervals, but it wasn't comforting. It felt like the light was fighting against something vast and unrelenting. The journal was still on the table where I'd left it. I opened it again, flipping through the pages. Most notes about weather patterns and maintenance logs. But near the back, the handwriting became more erratic. It starts as a whisper. You'll think it's just the wind, but it isn't. It never is. My hand trembled slightly as I closed the book and pushed it away. I couldn't stop the thoughts racing through my head. Had the last keeper lost their mind out here? Or was there something more to this place? As I turned off the lamp and lay down to sleep, I decided to ignore the questions. After all, it was only my first full day. I needed rest, but the whispers didn't let me sleep. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear them again, soft, insistent, and always just out of reach. By the time morning came, I felt like I'd barely closed my eyes, and as I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the sunlight creeping through the window, I couldn't help but wonder how long I'd last here. The third night was when things started to change, or at least that's when I began to notice. The day had passed like the others, slow and uneventful. I followed the checklist religiously, fuel for the lantern, weather updates logged in the book, and a few repairs to the railing outside. The routine was beginning to feel comforting, like the monotony itself was my shield against the strange unease that lingered in the air. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lighthouse seemed to exhale, settling into a quiet that felt different, heavier. I was in the kitchen again, going over the rules on the crumpled paper, hoping to make sense of the ones that didn't belong. Don't leave the tower after dark. Never ignore the ocean. What did they mean by ignore? It was such a strange word to use. Ignore how? Was I supposed to listen to the sound of the waves? Or to whatever else might be out there? The thoughts spun in my head as I finished eating and washed my dish in the tiny sink. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It had stopped ticking the first night I arrived, but I found myself looking at it out of habit. The hands were still frozen at 3:17. I turned off the kitchen light and headed up the stairs. The faint whistle of the wind accompanied me, the same sound I'd heard every night so far. But tonight, something about it was sharper. It wasn't just the wind whistling through cracks. It almost felt like words. I stopped on the stairs, straining to hear. Nothing, just the waves outside, crashing steadily against the rocks. The lantern room at the top of the tower was my last stop for the night. I opened the heavy door, and the light from the giant lens spilled over the space, illuminating the machinery. Everything seemed in order, but I had this nagging feeling like I was being watched. I turned toward the window that circled the room, staring out at the dark ocean. The beam of light swept across the waves, carving through the blackness like a blade. But as the light passed, for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something. A figure. It was too far out to make out details, but it was there, standing on the water. Still, watching, my breath caught in my throat. I blinked hard, willing my eyes to adjust, to see clearly. The light swung back, sweeping over the same spot. This time there was nothing, just endless waves, churning under the pale glow of the lantern. I exhaled shakily, shaking my head. "You're tired," I told myself. "It's late. This job's already messing with your head." I finished my checks as quickly as I could and left the lantern room, locking the door behind me. Back in my room, I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily these days, not with the whispers. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but the sound was getting harder to ignore. Tonight it was louder, not in volume exactly, but in how deliberate it felt. It wasn't random gusts or shifting air. It had a rhythm, almost like it was trying to form words. I pressed my hands over my ears, desperate for silence, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside me, in my head, like a thought I couldn't stop thinking. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but I woke with a start sometime in the early hours. My throat was dry, and my heart was pounding like I'd just run up the stairs. I couldn't remember what I'd been dreaming about, but the unease lingered. I sat up and froze. The door to my room, my locked door, was open. I stared at the door for a long time, my mind racing. Had I forgotten to lock it? I was sure I hadn't. I always locked it before bed. Always. The hallway beyond was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the lantern through the cracks in the stairwell. I got up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, and stepped into the hall. "Hello!" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the tower. No response. I moved toward the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The floorboards groaned softly beneath my feet, but there was no other sound, just the whisper of the wind outside. When I reached the bottom floor, I saw it immediately. The door to the lighthouse was wide open, swaying slightly in the wind. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I stood there, frozen, staring at the open doorway. I was certain I'd locked it earlier. I always locked it. I stepped closer, my breath visible in the frigid air. Beyond the door, the rocky shoreline stretched out toward the ocean, glinting faintly under the moonlight. And then I heard it again. My name. It wasn't shouted or even spoken loudly. It was barely more than a whisper, but it was clear, distinct. The sound came from outside, carried on the wind. I stood at the threshold, my hands gripping the edge of the doorframe, and stared into the darkness. The ocean was calm, the waves lapping gently against the rocks. But there was something out there. I could feel it. For a moment, I almost stepped outside. I didn't even think about it. My body just moved on its own, one foot edging past the doorway. But then I stopped, my mind snapping back to the rules. Don't leave the tower after dark. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling as I turned the key. I didn't go back to sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with the journal open in front of me, flipping through the pages over and over, searching for answers. The last few entries were frantic, the handwriting barely legible. It doesn't stop. No matter what you do, it doesn't stop. I can't stay here anymore. The words were scratched into the page, almost tearing through the paper. I closed the journal and set it aside, burying my face in my hands. My heart was racing, and no matter how many deep breaths I took, I couldn't calm down. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were still there, faint but steady, like a song stuck on repeat. And I knew, deep down, that they weren't going away. I just didn't know how much longer I could ignore them. The whispers didn't let up. By the fifth night, I'd stopped trying to explain them away. They weren't just the wind or the waves. They were something else, something alive. I'd barely slept since the night the door opened on its own. Every sound now felt sharper, every shadow heavier. Even during the day, the lighthouse seemed to pulse with an invisible weight, pressing in on me. I carried that weight everywhere, and by the time the sun set again, I could barely think straight. That evening, I climbed to the lantern room for the nightly checks. The climb felt longer than usual, every step echoing louder than it should have. When I reached the top, the air was colder, as if the temperature had dropped just in that part of the tower. I unlocked the heavy door and stepped inside. The light hummed faintly, its beam cutting through the darkness outside. Everything seemed fine at first. No loose bolts, no flickering. But then I noticed something odd. The window. There was a faint smudge on the glass, roughly the size of a hand. It wasn't there earlier in the day. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it. The smudge wasn't just a smear of dirt or condensation. It looked like a print, like someone had pressed their hand against the outside of the glass. But that was impossible. The window was over 50 feet above the ground. I felt my chest tighten, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I backed away from the glass and turned toward the door, ready to leave when the light flickered. It wasn't the soft, occasional flicker I'd seen before. This was sharp, aggressive, like the bulb was struggling to stay lit. The hum of the machinery grew louder, a low, grating sound that made my skin crawl. And then it stopped. The lantern went dark, plunging the room into silence. For a few moments, I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The rules were clear. Keep the light on. Always. But as I reached for the backup switch, something stopped me. There was a sound, soft at first, barely noticeable over the pounding of my heart. Came from the staircase behind me. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I turned toward the door, my hand shaking as I gripped the handle. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear, but there was nothing. No wind, no waves, just an empty, suffocating stillness. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The stairwell was dark, the faint glow of moonlight barely reaching the edges of the steps. I looked down but saw nothing, just the empty, spiraling staircase disappearing into the shadows below. But the feeling didn't go away. The air felt charged, like something was watching me. I went back into the lantern room and threw the backup switch. The light buzzed to life, flooding the room with its harsh glow. I exhaled, relief washing over me for a brief moment, until I turned back to the window. The smudge was gone, not smeared or faded. Gone as if it had never been there in the first place. I staggered back, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? Was it just my own reflection? Before I could think any further, the whispers came again. Louder now, more insistent. My name. This time I couldn't pretend it was the wind. The sound was too clear, too deliberate. It came from outside, from the direction of the ocean. I stepped toward the window, my legs feeling like lead. The light swept across the waves, illuminating the dark expanse. For a moment I saw nothing, just water stretching endlessly into the night. But as the light swung back, it caught something standing on the rocks at the edge of the shore. A figure. It was tall and motionless, its silhouette blurred by the crashing waves. I froze, unable to look away. The beam moved on, plunging the figure back into darkness, but I knew it was still there. My pulse raced as I backed away from the window, my thoughts spiraling. Had someone followed me here? Was it just my imagination? Or was it something worse? I didn't want to go outside. Every instinct screamed at me to stay in the tower, to lock the door and wait until morning. But the rules wouldn't let me. Never ignore the ocean. The words repeated in my mind, over and over, like a drumbeat. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. My name, again and again, pulling me toward the door. I didn't remember deciding to leave. One moment I was standing in the lantern room, and the next, I was on the staircase, my hand gripping the cold metal railing as I descended. The bottom floor was colder than usual, the wind pushing against the cracks in the walls. The door creaked as I unlocked it, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a wall. The ocean stretched out before me, its surface shimmering under the moonlight. The figure was gone. Feel it. You know, life has a funny way of putting you in situations you'd never expect. I wasn't looking for anything extraordinary, just a job to pay the bills. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. When I saw the listing for an animal caretaker, I thought, why not? I've always liked animals. They don't judge, they don't argue, they just exist. At the time, things were tight. Rent was overdue. My fridge looked like a barren wasteland, and my phone buzzed with friendly reminders about bills. You've been there, right? Desperate times call for quick decisions, and this seemed simple enough. Feed the animals, keep their spaces clean, and clock out. No degree required, no previous experience necessary. Perfect. When I called the number, I expected a bored receptionist or a robotic voicemail, but instead, I got this deep, calm voice. We've been looking for someone like you, the man said. Not someone willing, not someone available, but someone like me. Strange, right? I brushed it off. The guy asked if I could meet him at the facility later that night. Yes, night. That should have been my first red flag. But I'm a night owl, always have been. Nights are quiet, peaceful, my kind of vibe. So I didn't think twice about it. The facility, as he called it, was tucked away at the edge of town. No signs, no big gates, nothing that screamed official. It looked more like an old warehouse with a few lights flickering outside. My first thought was, did I just sign up for some shady underground gig? But again, desperate times. I parked my car, took a deep breath, and stepped out. The air was heavy, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you know you're alone. The building smelled like damp wood and metal, a mix of old and forgotten things. Inside, it wasn't much better. Dim lights lined the hallways, casting long shadows on the walls. I half expected rats to scurry past me. Instead, there was a small reception desk, and behind it sat a man in his 50s, wearing a plain gray uniform. His name tag read, Mr. Harland. He didn't look up right away. When he finally did, his piercing eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt like I'd walked into something bigger than myself. But he smiled, an odd, almost forced smile, and motioned for me to sit. So, you're here for the caretaker position? His voice was calm but had this weight to it, like he was testing me with every word. I nodded, trying to act cool, but my hands were clenched so tightly in my lap I thought they might leave marks. He explained the job. Feed the animals twice a night, clean up their spaces if needed, and make sure all enclosures were secure. Simple enough. And the animals? I asked. What kind are we talking about? He paused. It wasn't a long pause, but it felt heavy, like he was deciding whether or not to answer. Exotic, he said finally. Rare. You won't find these in any zoo. That should have been my second red flag, but curiosity got the better of me. Plus, I wasn't exactly in a position to be picky. Sounds interesting, I said, trying to sound casual. Mr. Harland leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. One thing you should know, we have rules here. Follow them no matter what. If you can't, this job isn't for you. Rules? Sure, every job has rules, right? But the way he said it didn't feel like he was talking about safety regulations or company policies. It felt personal. Got it, I said, though I wasn't sure I did. Good, he said, sliding a small notebook across the desk. Your shift starts tomorrow night. Read this before then. Memorize it. I flipped through the notebook later that night in my car, and that's when I started to feel uneasy. The rules weren't normal. Don't look directly into their eyes. If one of them speaks, don't respond. And the last one, never, ever open the red door. My stomach twisted. This was no ordinary job. But by then, it was too late. I was in. The next night, I drove back to the facility. It was quiet just like before, but now I felt different, less confident. That little notebook sat in the passenger seat, and I'd read through it more times than I wanted to admit. The rules, they weren't just instructions, they felt like warnings. Here's a taste of what I'm talking about. If the lights in the main hallway flicker, stop walking and wait for them to stabilize. Do not look behind you. Ignore any knocking on the door during feeding rounds. No matter how loud or desperate it sounds, if you hear a growl, hum softly. Keep humming until it stops. Never, under any circumstance, open the red door. At first, I thought, okay, this has to be a joke. It read more like something out of a horror movie than a job manual. But then I remembered Mr. Harlan's face. Calm, serious, like he wasn't messing around. Still, I tried to convince myself it was just some over-the-top safety policy. You know, the kind of thing they add to scare off people who aren't serious about the job. But deep down, something didn't sit right. When I arrived, the place looked just as eerie as the night before. The lights outside still flickered, and the shadows they cast seemed to stretch longer than they should. As I walked inside, I noticed the air felt heavier, like the walls were closing in on me. Mr. Harlan was already waiting at the front desk. This time, he wasn't smiling. You read the rules? He asked, his voice flat. Yeah, I said, holding up the notebook. And they're different, I admitted. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. Different isn't the word I'd use. They're important. Memorize them. Stick to them. You'll be fine. I nodded, but my throat felt tight. I wanted to ask why these rules existed, what they were really about, but something in his expression told me not to push. Instead, I asked, what happens if you don't follow them? His face didn't change. He just said, you don't want to find out. Mr. Harlan led me through the main hallway, where the enclosures were. The smell of damp metal and something earthy filled the air. It wasn't unpleasant, but it felt wrong, somehow, like the kind of scent that lingered in places it shouldn't. We passed the first enclosure, and I couldn't see much through the foggy glass. Just a faint silhouette, something big with long limbs and a hunched back. My instinct was to slow down and get a better look, but Mr. Harlan's hand shot out, motioning me to keep walking. Don't linger, he said, not even glancing at the enclosure. What is it? I asked. He didn't answer. That's when I noticed the red door at the end of the hallway. It looked ordinary enough, wooden with chipped paint and a rusted handle. But something about it made my skin crawl. That's the red door, he said, his voice lower now. You know the rule. I nodded quickly, not trusting myself to say anything. The rest of the tour was just as unsettling. Mr. Harlan explained the feeding process. Each enclosure had a small metal slot where you'd slide the food tray through. Never open the main door. Never stick your hand in. And if you ever hear anything unusual, growling, scratching, or even voices, step away and wait. What kind of animals are these? I asked again, hoping this time he'd give me a straight answer. Exotic, he repeated, his tone making it clear that was all I was getting. He handed me a keyring, each one marked with a number that matched an enclosure. Then, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Stick to the rules, and you'll get through your shift just fine." I tried to act casual as I nodded, but my mind was racing. Why all the secrecy? Why all the rules? And why did I feel like I was being watched every time I stepped near one of the enclosures? When Mr. Harland left, I stood alone in the main hallway, clutching the keys like they were a lifeline. The place was quiet, too quiet. No animals making noise, no hum of machinery, just the faint buzz of the overhead lights. I decided to start with the first enclosure, the one with the foggy glass. The slot for the food tray was cold and slightly damp when I touched it. I slid the tray through, half expecting to hear something, maybe a grunt or the sound of claws on metal, but there was nothing. I took a step back, waiting, but nothing moved. As I turned to head to the next enclosure, I heard it. A soft knock, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze. It wasn't loud, just faint, like someone gently tapping on a door. The rules flashed in my mind. Ignore any knocking. I told myself it was probably just the pipes or the building settling. Old places make noises, right? But the knocking came again, 3 short, deliberate taps. I clenched my fists and kept walking, my steps quicker now. By the time I reached the second enclosure, my heart was pounding. I slid the tray through and stepped back, half expecting another sound. Instead, I felt a cold draft brush past me, even though the air was still. As I finished the first round of feeding, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The notebook rules swirled in my mind, each one a thread pulling tighter around my nerves. I hadn't broken any rules, but the night was far from over. For the first hour, nothing happened. It was almost boring. The animals stayed quiet, the halls were still, and I started to think I'd overhyped everything in my head. Maybe the rules were just a precaution, a way to keep the workers alert. I mean, think about it. Don't look behind you? Don't open a door? It all felt a little ridiculous in the bright glow of the hallway lights. So I let myself relax just a bit. Big mistake. I was midway through my second round of feeding when it started. I had just finished with enclosure 3, sliding the tray through the slot, when the lights in the hallway flickered. Not a subtle flicker, but a sudden, almost angry burst, as if the bulbs were struggling to stay alive. My heart skipped. The rules flashed in my mind. If the lights flicker, stop walking and wait. Do not look behind you. I froze where I stood, gripping the keyring so hard it bit into my palm. The hallway went dark for what felt like forever. I could hear the faint hum of the electricity trying to kick back on, but all I could think about was that second part of the rule. Don't look behind you. I told myself it was nothing, just faulty wiring, maybe a storm outside that I hadn't noticed. But then I felt it. The air behind me changed, colder, heavier, pressed against my back like a weight, and for a second, I thought I heard breathing. Slow, steady, too close. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to look, to confirm there was nothing there. But I couldn't. Instead, I focused on the sound of my own breathing, trying to keep it quiet, steady. The lights flickered one more time, then stayed on. The cold air vanished as quickly as it had come. I stood there for a moment, letting my heart settle, and then forced myself to move. At the next enclosure, my hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped the food tray. I slid it through the slot and stepped back quickly, keeping my eyes fixed on the glass. For the first time, I saw movement. It was subtle, just a shadow shifting near the back of the enclosure, but it was enough to send a chill crawling up my spine. Whatever was inside wasn't small. It wasn't harmless. I tried to shake it off and continue the rounds, but I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see, I don't even know, someone. By the time I reached the staff room for my break, I was on edge. The room was small and bare, a table, a chair, and a monitor displaying the security camera feeds. I poured myself a cup of stale coffee, hoping it would calm my nerves, and glanced at the monitor. Most of the enclosures were still, the animals either hidden or asleep. But one feed caught my attention. Enclosure 7. The camera showed an empty space, just the plain metal walls of the enclosure. But I knew I'd fed something there. I'd heard it moving. I leaned closer, staring at the screen, and that's when it happened. A shadow. It darted across the frame, too fast for me to make out any details, but big enough to make my stomach drop. I tapped the monitor, hoping it was just a glitch, but the shadow appeared again, closer this time. Then the screen went black. I stumbled back from the monitor, my pulse racing. The rules didn't say anything about what to do if a camera feed went out. Should I check the enclosure? Call Mr. Harland? No, the rules were clear about one thing. Follow them and you'll be fine. I had to trust that. Still, the next round felt different. The halls seemed darker, quieter, like the air itself was waiting for something. As I approached enclosure 7, I noticed the food tray I'd slid in earlier was untouched. The metal slot was slightly ajar, though, like something or someone had tried to open it. I stared at it, my gut screaming at me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. The rules said nothing about skipping enclosures. Carefully, I slid the tray back through and stepped away, my eyes glued to the foggy glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, deep enough to rattle the walls. The rules flashed again in my mind. If you hear a growl, hum softly. Hum? That's what they wanted me to do. I hesitated, my mind racing, but the growl came again, louder this time. My throat was dry, but I started to hum. A shaky, uneven melody, the first thing that came to mind. The growling stopped just like that. I stood there, humming, until my voice cracked. Then I backed away slowly, my legs shaking, and made my way to the next enclosure. By the end of the night, I was exhausted mentally, physically, in every possible way. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were survival tactics, each one more unsettling than the last. I sat in my car after my shift, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the building. The job paid well, sure, but was it worth this? As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, that the rules weren't just about keeping the animals contained. They were about keeping me alive. I told myself I'd quit after one more night. No paycheck was worth the constant fear, the rules that felt more like riddles, and the sense that this place was alive in ways I couldn't explain. But when I walked through the doors for what I thought would be my final shift, everything felt different. The air was colder, heavier, like the building itself was warning me to turn back. Still, I pushed forward. The sooner I started, the sooner I'd be out of there. The first few rounds were uneventful, almost eerily so. The animals were quiet, the hallways still. I told myself it was a blessing, but deep down I knew better. The calm never lasted. It was during my second round that I noticed something was wrong. The hallway lights flickered again. Longer this time, as if they were struggling against something unseen. I stopped walking, just like the rules said, my breath caught in my throat. The shadows on the walls stretched unnaturally, bending and twisting in ways they shouldn't. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing faintly behind me. My heart raced, my body stiff. I knew the rule, don't look behind you. But knowing and doing are two very different things. The footsteps got louder, closer, until they stopped just a few feet away. I could feel something standing there, watching me. I clenched my fists, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I stayed rooted to the spot. And then it spoke, a low, distorted voice, like it was crawling its way through a broken speaker. "Why are you here?" My mind went blank. The rules didn't say anything about this. "Leave," the voice hissed, cold and sharp, sending a shiver down my spine. Before it's too late, the lights flickered one last time before stabilizing, and just like that, the presence was gone. I rushed through the rest of the round, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the keyring. By the time I reached the staff room, I felt like I'd been running a marathon. I sat down, my back to the wall, and tried to catch my breath. The security monitor was on, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. I didn't want to see whatever was lurking out there. But then I heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from the hallway outside the staff room. It wasn't knocking, exactly, more like something sharp dragging against the walls. Tap, tap, scratch. The sound got louder, closer, until it stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, praying it would go away, but then the doorknob rattled. The rules flashed in my mind. Ignore any knocking. But this wasn't knocking. This was worse. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. But then a voice, soft and childlike, came from the other side of the door. "Please, help me." My blood ran cold. "Let me in," the voice pleaded, trembling like it was barely holding back tears. I wanted to scream, to run, but all I could do was sit there, frozen. My mind raced. "It's not real. It's not real." The voice grew louder, more desperate. "Please, they're going to hurt me." Tears welled in my eyes. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time, like something was throwing its full weight against the door. And then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, I forced myself to move. My legs felt like jelly as I stood and opened the door, half expecting to see, I don't even know. But the hallway was empty, as if nothing had happened. I convinced myself to finish the shift. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I didn't, whatever was in this place would come after me. By the time I reached the final enclosure, I was running on pure adrenaline. The red door loomed at the end of the hallway, its chipped paint almost glowing under the flickering lights. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The rule was simple. Never, ever open the red door. But something was different. The air around the door seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from asphalt. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from behind the door. "Come closer." I backed away, my hands trembling. "Please," the voice said, soft and sweet. "It's safe. Promise." I shook my head, forcing myself to focus on the rule. Never open the door. But then I heard something else. Footsteps.